Forget everything you think you know about the calm, blue ocean. Today, we're diving into the absolute terrifying truth. Real-life encounters from deep-sea divers that will make your skin crawl. These aren't fictional stories. These are the heart-stopping, bone-chilling experiences of people who faced unspeakable horrors in the crushing depths. You've been warned. The Caribbean waters had never felt so cold against Thomas Mitchell's wetsuit, despite the thermometer reading a comfortable 78 degrees. Something was fundamentally wrong with this dive site, though he couldn't quite place what it was. The British marine archaeologist had explored hundreds of underwater ruins across the globe, but this particular coordinate, sent anonymously to his university email 3 weeks ago, felt different. Dangerous, even. "Radio check, Thomas," came the voice of Dr. Isabella Rodriguez through his underwater communication system. The Spanish oceanographer was monitoring from their research vessel, the Neptune's Eye, floating somewhere in the darkness above. "You're at 250 feet. How's visibility down there?" Thomas adjusted his powerful LED array, watching the beams cut through the murky water like knives through silk. Crystal clear, surprisingly. Almost too clear for these depths. He paused, studying his depth gauge. "Isabella, are you certain about these coordinates? My sonar isn't picking up any geological formations that would suggest ruins." "Positive. The satellite imagery from Dr. James Crawford's team in Australia showed definitive structural anomalies. Keep descending." Dr. Crawford. Thomas had worked with the Melbourne-based marine geologist before, and the man's reputation for accuracy was unquestionable. If Crawford said there were ruins here, there were ruins here. But as Thomas descended past the 275-foot mark, an inexplicable sense of dread began crawling up his spine like icy fingers. The water around him seemed to grow thicker, more resistant to his movements. His breathing apparatus, which had functioned perfectly during his pre-dive checks, now felt as though it was delivering air through a straw. Each breath required more effort than the last, yet his gauges showed normal pressure and oxygen levels. At exactly 300 feet, Thomas saw it. Rising from the ocean floor like a monument to forgotten prayers, the structure defied every law of physics and marine archaeology he'd ever studied. It was a chapel, complete, pristine, and utterly impossible. Gothic spires reached upward through the water, their carved stone surfaces showing no signs of coral growth, no marine incrustation, no evidence of centuries beneath the waves. Stained glass windows, somehow intact and gleaming, depicted scenes of biblical torment in colors that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. "Dear God," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible through the comm system. "Thomas, what are you seeing down there?" Isabella's voice carried a note of concern. "Your vitals just spiked." He couldn't answer immediately. The chapel's massive wooden doors stood slightly ajar, and from within that crack of darkness, something was calling to him, not with words, but with a pulse so strong it felt like invisible chains wrapped around his chest, drawing him forward against his will. "There's a church down here, Isabella. A complete, undamaged church at 300 feet. This is impossible. Marine growth should have consumed any structure within decades. But this looks like it was built yesterday." Static crackled through his earpiece before Isabella's voice returned, strained and distant. "Thomas, I'm reading some unusual electromagnetic interference up here. Dr. Peterson from the Norwegian Maritime Institute just called. They've been tracking some strange anomalies in this area. You need to document quickly and surface." Dr. Eric Peterson. Thomas knew him by reputation. A brilliant scientist who never made claims he couldn't back with data. If Peterson was concerned about this location, Thomas should be terrified. But the pull toward the chapel doors grew stronger with each passing second. Against every instinct screaming at him to surface immediately, Thomas found himself swimming closer to the impossible structure. His camera equipment, state-of-the-art technology that had never failed him, began producing images filled with static and shadow, as if the chapel itself was rejecting documentation. As he approached the entrance, Thomas noticed something that made his blood freeze in his veins. The doors weren't just ajar, they were breathing. opening and closing with a rhythm that matched the beating of a human heart, each movement accompanied by the soft creak of ancient hinges that somehow carried perfectly through the water. Isabella, are you getting this footage? Negative, Thomas. All we're receiving is static. Your camera feed went dark about 2 minutes ago. I'm recommending immediate ascent. But Thomas was already reaching for the door handle, an ornate piece of wrought iron shaped like a human hand, fingers extended as if beckoning him inside. The moment his gloved fingers made contact with the metal, visions flooded his mind with the force of a tidal wave. He saw the chapel as it once was, standing proudly on a Caribbean island that no longer existed. He witnessed the terrible night when the sea rose to claim it, saw the congregation trapped inside as the waters rushed through windows and doors. But these people hadn't drowned. Something far more sinister had happened to them. They had been chosen. The iron handle turned easily in his grip, and the door swung open to reveal an interior that defied the laws of underwater physics. The chapel was filled not with water, but with air. Impossible, suffocating air that reeked of centuries-old incense, and something else, something rotting. Thomas's regulator should have prevented him from breathing this air, yet somehow it filled his lungs anyway. The taste was metallic, tinged with copper and despair. Wooden pews lined the chapel in perfect rows, each one occupied by a congregation that time had forgotten. The parishioners sat in silent prayer, their clothes from another century somehow pristine and dry. Men in formal suits with high collars, women in elaborate dresses, with their hair pinned in styles from the 1800s, children clutching prayer books with small, pale hands. None of them moved. None of them breathed. But all of them were somehow impossibly alive. Thomas. Isabella's voice was becoming increasingly frantic, though it now sounded as if she were calling from another world entirely. The surface team is reading massive pressure changes. Whatever you're doing down there, stop. At the front of the chapel, behind an altar carved from black coral that shouldn't exist at these depths, stood a figure in priest's robes. Father Miguel Santos. Though Thomas had no way of knowing the man's name, it simply appeared in his mind like a brand burned into his consciousness. The priest's face was pale as moonlight, his eyes black as the deepest ocean trenches. Father Santos smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous, and too eager. "Welcome, my child," the priest said, his voice somehow carrying perfectly through the water that wasn't water, through the air that couldn't exist. "We've been waiting for you for so very long." The congregation turned as one to face Thomas, their movements perfectly synchronized like marionettes controlled by a single puppeteer. Their faces were human, but wrong, skin too tight, eyes too bright, smiles too wide. They had been preserved by whatever dark force had claimed this place, kept alive by something that demanded worship, demanded sacrifice. "I've been sending out the call," Father Santos continued, gesturing to the impossible chapel around them. "Coordinates to explorers, researchers, curious. You're not the first to answer, Thomas Mitchell, but you may be the last we need." The priest raised his hands, and the chapel began to sing. It wasn't music in any conventional sense, but rather a sound that bypassed the ears entirely and resonated directly in the bone marrow. The congregation joined in, their mouths opening wide, too wide, revealing throats that seemed to extend infinitely downward into darkness. The stained glass windows pulsed with each note, their biblical scenes of torment becoming more vivid, more real. Thomas tried to swim backward, to escape through the doors, but found his movements sluggish and uncoordinated. The song was doing something to him, changing him at a cellular level. He could feel his skin beginning to tighten, his eyes growing brighter and more sensitive to the chapel's unnatural light. "Isabella!" he screamed into his comm system, but only static answered. The connection to the surface world was severed, cut by forces beyond human understanding. "Don't fight it, my child," Father Santos crooned, his voice now coming from inside Thomas's own head. "Join our eternal service. Help us call others to this holy place. There's so much work to be done." The priest gestured to the walls of the chapel, and Thomas saw them covered in photographs, documents, and personal effects. diving equipment from a dozen different countries, research papers with names he recognized: Dr. Marie Dubois from France, Professor Hans Weber from Germany, Dr. Jennifer Walsh from Canada, all marine archaeologists, all missing, all sitting in the pews now, their faces bearing that same too bright smile, their eyes reflecting the stained glass light, like mirrors reflecting hell. The sea gives up her dead, Father Santos intoned, but only to serve a greater purpose. This chapel has stood guard over something ancient, something that predates human civilization. We are its guardians now, its congregation, its voice calling across the waters. Thomas felt his own will slipping away, like sand through fingers. The song was too beautiful, too compelling. Part of him wanted to take his place among the congregation, to serve whatever entity had transformed this place into its underwater cathedral. The promise of eternal service, of purpose beyond mortal understanding, whispered seductively in his ears. But somewhere in the depths of his dissolving consciousness, Thomas remembered Isabella's voice, remembered the world above where the sun still shone, and people lived and breathed and died in their own time. With tremendous effort, he forced his hand to his weight belt and triggered the emergency ascent system. The sudden upward pull broke the chapel's hold on him, at least partially. As he rose through the impossible air toward the doors, he heard Father Santos laugh, a sound like breaking glass and drowning children. "You cannot escape what you've seen, Thomas Mitchell. The knowledge will eat at you like acid. You'll return to us, or you'll bring others in your place. The sea always collects what she's owed." Thomas burst through the chapel doors back into the blessed cold of real seawater. His ascent was too rapid, dangerous, but he didn't care. Behind him, he could hear the chapel's bells beginning to toll, deep, resonant chimes that carried through the water with impossible clarity, calling to any who might hear them, summoning them to service. At 200 feet, his camera equipment suddenly sparked back to life, Isabella's frantic voice filling his ears. "Thomas, thank God. We lost you for over an hour. Your depth readings showed you at 300 feet, but sonar showed nothing there. What happened?" Thomas wanted to tell her everything, to warn her about the chapel and its hungry congregation, but when he opened his mouth to speak, he found he could only whisper. Nothing. Equipment malfunction. Coming up. Because he knew, with the certainty of the damned, that speaking the truth aloud would only make it more real, would only help spread the call. The knowledge sat in his mind like a tumor, growing and pulsing with each heartbeat. As he breached the surface and was pulled aboard the Neptune's Eye, Thomas caught sight of his reflection in the ship's window. For just a moment, his eyes seemed brighter than they should be, his smile just a touch too wide. Isabella helped him out of his gear, chattering excitedly about the electromagnetic anomalies they'd recorded, the unusual sonar readings, the possibilities for future exploration. She was already planning a return trip, assembling a team of international experts. Dr. Crawford from Australia was interested. Professor Liu from China had cleared his schedule. Dr. Larson from Denmark was bringing his most advanced diving equipment. Thomas said nothing, but deep in his chest, he could feel something singing. The chapel bells were still tolling, 300 feet below, calling to anyone who would listen. And Thomas knew, with the certainty of someone who had looked into the eyes of the damned, that he would be back. After all, Father Santos was right. The sea always collected what she was owed. And somewhere in the depths of the Caribbean, in a chapel that shouldn't exist, the congregation grew larger every day. Their two bright eyes watching the surface, their two wide smiles promising that the song would never end. The bells toll still. They're calling to you. The North Atlantic had claimed countless vessels over the centuries, but none quite like the SS Meridian. Vincent Crawford adjusted his diving gear one final time as the research vessel Aurora bobbed violently in the churning waters above. The storm had been brewing for 3 days, and this might be their last chance to explore the wreck before weather forced them back to port. "You sure about this dive, Vincent?" Captain Dmitry Volkov's weathered face showed genuine concern as he secured the dive platform. "The currents down there are unpredictable today." Vincent nodded grimly. The maritime archaeologist had spent 2 years tracking down this particular wreck. The SS Meridian had vanished without a trace in 1943, carrying a cargo manifest that had been classified by 3 different governments. Now, 79 years later, sonar had finally located her resting place 400 feet beneath the surface. "Dr. Blackwood is counting on these artifacts," Vincent replied, checking his air supply. "The university won't fund another expedition if we come back empty-handed." As he descended through the murky waters, Vincent's powerful diving lights cut through the darkness like golden spears. Schools of deep-sea fish scattered before him, their pale bodies ghostly against the black void. The water grew colder with each passing fathom, and soon the familiar crushing sensation of the deep began to press against his consciousness. At 350 feet, the outline of the freighter emerged from the gloom like a sleeping behemoth. The SS Meridian lay on her starboard side, her massive hull split open like a cracked egg. Decades of ocean currents had stripped away most of her paint, leaving behind a skeleton of rusted metal and twisted steel. Vincent approached the main cargo hold, his breathing steady and controlled through the regulator. The manifest had indicated that the ship was carrying more than just wartime supplies. There were rumors of archaeological treasures, ancient artifacts being transported from occupied territories back to Allied nations for safekeeping. As he swam through the gaping hole in the ship's side, Vincent's lights illuminated a scene of frozen chaos. Cargo containers lay scattered across the tilted floor, many split open and spilling their contents into the murky water. But it was the perfect preservation that caught his attention. Despite 8 decades underwater, many organic materials remained intact, protected by the cold temperatures and lack of oxygen. Moving deeper into the vessel, Vincent consulted his waterproof map. The manifest indicated that the most valuable cargo would be stored in the secured compartments near the ship's center. He swam through what had once been a corridor, his fins stirring up clouds of sediment that danced in his light beams. That was when he heard it, a rhythmic sound echoing through the water-filled passages. At first, Vincent dismissed it as the natural creaking of old metal under pressure. But as he paused to listen, the sound became more distinct, more purposeful. It sounded almost like breathing. Vincent's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to remain calm. Nitrogen narcosis could cause auditory hallucinations at this depth, and panic was a diver's greatest enemy. He continued forward, following his planned route toward the secured storage areas. The corridor opened into what appeared to be the ship's main cargo bay. Vincent's lights swept across the cavernous space, revealing dozens of wooden crates and metal containers. Many were still sealed, their contents a mystery waiting to be unveiled. But as he moved closer to examine the nearest crate, the breathing sound returned. This time, it was accompanied by something else. Footsteps. The metallic echoing of boots against steel plating reverberated through the flooded corridors behind him. Vincent spun around, his lights cutting through the water, but saw nothing except the empty passage he had just traversed. "Impossible," he whispered into his regulator, the words lost in a stream of bubbles. Dead ships didn't walk. Dead crews didn't breathe. Vincent had explored dozens of wrecks throughout his career, from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, and he knew the psychological tricks that isolation and pressure could play on the human mind. But the sounds continued. As Vincent moved deeper into the cargo bay, examining the sealed containers for signs of the artifacts mentioned in the classified manifest, the footsteps seemed to follow him. They maintained a steady rhythm, always staying just beyond the reach of his lights. Sometimes they came from above, echoing through the upper decks. Other times they seemed to originate from the flooded engine compartments below. Opening his dive bag, Vincent began photographing the cargo containers and their identification numbers. Dr. Blackwood would want detailed documentation of everything they found. As he worked, he tried to focus on the scientific aspects of the dive, pushing aside the growing sense of unease that had settled in his chest. A loud clang echoed through the water, the sound of metal striking metal with tremendous force. Vincent froze, his camera suspended in the water beside him. The sound had come from somewhere near the ship's bow, in the direction of the crew quarters. Against his better judgment, He found himself swimming toward the source of the noise. The corridor leading to the bow section was narrower than the cargo areas, and Vincent had to be careful not to damage his equipment on the jagged edges of torn metal. As he progressed, his lights revealed personal belongings scattered throughout the passage. A coffee cup, still resting on what had been a table. A photograph in a waterproof frame, showing a young woman with children. The breathing sounds grew stronger here, more pronounced. They seemed to emanate from the very walls of the ship, as if the vessel itself had developed lungs and was drawing air that no longer existed. Vincent reached the crew quarters and began to explore the individual cabins. Most were small, cramped spaces that had once housed the men who worked this vessel. But in the third cabin he entered, Vincent discovered something that made his blood run cold. A diving suit. Not a modern suit like his own, but an old-fashioned hard-hat diving apparatus from the 1940s era. The brass helmet gleamed despite decades underwater, and the canvas suit appeared to be in remarkable condition. But it was the position of the suit that disturbed Vincent most. It was standing upright, as if someone had just stepped out of it moments before. Vincent circled the suit carefully, his lights playing across its surface. There were no air hoses connected to it, no way for anyone to have been using the equipment. Yet it stood there in the flooded cabin like a sentinel, its dark faceplate reflecting his lights back at him. As he moved closer to examine the helmet, Vincent heard the breathing sounds again, but this time they seemed to be coming from inside the diving suit itself. The rational part of his mind knew this was impossible. No one could survive 8 decades underwater. No one could breathe in a flooded diving suit with no air supply. But as he listened, the rhythmic pattern of inhalation and exhalation became unmistakable. Something was breathing inside that helmet. Vincent backed away from the suit, his own breathing becoming rapid and shallow. He needed to return to the surface, to report his findings to Captain Volkov and Dr. Blackwood. But as he turned to leave the cabin, he found his path blocked. Another diving suit stood in the doorway. This one was different from the first, older and more corroded. Barnacles had attached themselves to the brass fittings, and seaweed drifted from the joints in the canvas. But like the first suit, it stood upright and motionless, its dark faceplate turned toward Vincent. The breathing sounds multiplied, coming from both suits now. The rhythmic pattern created a harmony that echoed through the flooded compartments like some underwater funeral dirge. Vincent's hands trembled as he reached for his emergency ascent device, but before he could activate it, more figures appeared in the corridor beyond. A parade of diving suits, each from a different era, each standing in perfect formation along the narrow passage. Some wore the heavy brass helmets of deep-sea salvage operations. Others displayed the more modern equipment of military divers. All of them stood motionless in the dark water, their breathing creating a chorus that filled the ship with ghostly whispers. Vincent's mind raced as he tried to understand what he was seeing. Had the SS Meridian been involved in some kind of diving operation when she sank? Were these the remains of a salvage crew that had been trapped when the vessel went down? But as he studied the suits more closely, Vincent realized the truth was far more terrifying. The suits were from different time periods, spanning decades of diving technology. Some predated the sinking of the SS Meridian by years, while others appeared to be from the 1960s and 1970s. It was as if every diver who had ever died in these waters had somehow found their way to this ship, drawn by some magnetic force that kept their spirits anchored to the ocean floor. The breathing sounds intensified, and Vincent could hear something else mixed in with the rhythmic inhalations. Voices speaking in languages he couldn't identify. Some sounded European, others had the flat vowels of North American accents. All of them seemed to be trying to communicate something urgent, something important that they needed Vincent to understand. Moving carefully through the corridor of diving suits, Vincent tried to reach the main passage that would lead him back to his entry point. But with each step, more figures appeared. They emerged from doorways and hatches, from flooded compartments and collapsed sections of the ship. Each one stood silently in the water, their dark faceplates following his movement as he passed. The temperature of the water seemed to drop even further, and Vincent's exposure suit struggled to maintain his body heat. Ice crystals began forming on his regulator, and his breathing became labored as the cold air hurt his lungs. As he rounded a corner near the ship's galley, Vincent encountered the most disturbing sight yet. A diving suit knelt beside what appeared to be an altar made from stacked cargo containers. The figure's gloved hands moved in a pattern that resembled prayer, and as Vincent watched, other suits began to gather around the makeshift shrine. They were worshipping something. Vincent forced himself to move closer, his scientific curiosity overriding his fear. As his lights illuminated the altar, he could see that the cargo containers were arranged around a central object. It appeared to be some kind of artifact, carved from black stone and covered in symbols that didn't match any ancient language Vincent had studied. The artifact pulsed with a faint inner light, and as Vincent watched, he realized that the breathing sounds were synchronized with its rhythm. Whatever this object was, it seemed to be the source of the supernatural activity aboard the SS Meridian. The diving suits around the altar turned toward Vincent as one, their movements creating small whirlpools in the water. The breathing sounds became more urgent, more insistent. Vincent could feel the weight of their attention pressing down on him like the ocean pressure itself. One of the suits stepped forward, its movements surprisingly fluid for something that should have been dead for decades. It raised one gloved hand and pointed toward the artifact, then gestured toward Vincent's dive bag. The message was clear. They wanted him to take the object. Vincent hesitated. Every instinct told him to flee, to return to the surface and report what he had found to the proper authorities. But the suits pressed closer, and he could hear new sounds echoing through the ship. The groaning of metal under stress, as if the vessel was preparing to shift position on the ocean floor. With trembling hands, Vincent approached the altar and carefully lifted the artifact. It was heavier than he expected, and warm to the touch despite the freezing water. As soon as he placed it in his dive bag, the breathing sound stopped. The sudden silence was more frightening than the ghostly chorus had been. Vincent looked around and realized that all the diving suits had vanished, leaving him alone in the flooded ship once again. But his relief was short-lived. The SS Meridian began to move. What had been a stable wreck for 8 decades suddenly started to shift and settle deeper into the ocean floor. Vincent felt the deck tilting beneath him as massive sections of the hull gave way under their own weight. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the screech of metal tearing apart as the ship began to collapse in on itself. Vincent swam desperately toward his exit point, but the passages he had navigated earlier were now blocked by fallen debris. The ship was dying around him, finally succumbing to the damage it had sustained so many years ago, and he was trapped inside. His air supply gauge showed that he had less than 10 minutes of breathing gas remaining. Even if he could find another way out, he would never make it to the surface in time. Vincent felt the cold grip of panic threatening to overwhelm him, but he forced himself to think rationally. There had to be another exit. Ships of this size always had multiple access points, emergency hatches that could be used in case of disaster. Vincent consulted his mental map of the vessel and remembered seeing a service tunnel near the engine room that might lead to an external maintenance hatch. Swimming through the collapsing corridors, Vincent could feel the artifact in his dive bag growing warmer. Whatever power it contained seemed to be responding to the ship's death throes, pulsing faster as the vessel settled deeper into its final resting place. The service tunnel was narrow and partially blocked by fallen pipes, but Vincent managed to squeeze through. His lights revealed a ladder leading upward, and at the top, he could see the outline of a hatch. With his air supply running dangerously low, Vincent climbed toward what he hoped would be his salvation. The hatch was corroded and difficult to open, but desperation gave Vincent the strength he needed. As the metal door swung open, he felt the current change around him, indicating that he had found an opening to the outside water. Vincent swam clear of the dying ship, just as a massive section of the superstructure collapsed into the cargo bay where he had been exploring. The SS Meridian shuddered one final time and settled deeper into the ocean floor, finally claiming its place as a permanent resident of the deep. As Vincent began his ascent to the surface, he could feel the artifact in his dive bag pulsing with an otherworldly energy. Whatever he had taken from that underwater altar, it was something that had been waiting decades for someone to carry it back to the world above. But as he rose through the dark water toward the storm-tossed surface, Vincent couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone. The breathing sounds had returned, softer now, but still present. And in the depths below, he could swear he saw the faint glow of diving helmet lights, following him upward like a procession of underwater ghosts. The SS Meridian had finally released its deepest secret, but Vincent was beginning to understand that some things were buried beneath the waves for very good reasons. And now, whatever ancient power had been sleeping in the depths was coming home with him, carried in his dive bag like a time bomb waiting to explode. As the first hints of surface light began to penetrate the darkness above, Vincent Crawford realized that his exploration of the breathing shipwreck was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The darkness beneath the Mariana Trench holds secrets that mankind was never meant to discover. Professional deep-sea explorer Jackson Torres had descended into these forbidden waters 300 times before, but tonight would be different. Tonight, something ancient and hungry was waiting for him in the deepest parts of our planet. Jackson adjusted his diving helmet one final time as the research vessel Northern Star rocked gently in the Pacific swells. His Canadian diving partner, Oliver Matthews, was running final equipment checks on the surface, while British marine biologist Dr. Victoria Harrington monitored the dive computers from the control room. "All systems green, Jackson." Victoria's voice crackled through the comm system. "You're cleared for descent to 12,000 meters. Remember, we lose communication at 8,000 due to the thermal layers." The water was black as ink as Jackson activated his descent thrusters. The familiar sensation of pressure building around his reinforced diving suit should have been comforting after all these years, but something felt different tonight. The ocean seemed alive, pulsing with an energy he had never experienced before. At 4,000 meters, his powerful LED lights began to reveal the first signs of deep-sea life. Bioluminescent jellyfish drifted past like ghostly lanterns, their tentacles trailing poison in the current. But as he descended further, even these hardy creatures disappeared, leaving him alone in the most isolated place on Earth. "Depth 7,000 meters, Jackson reported into his microphone, knowing this would be his last communication with the surface team. The crushing weight of the ocean pressed against his suit, but the advanced technology kept him safe. Or so he believed. 8,000 meters. The silence was complete now. No radio chatter, no mechanical hums from the surface vessel above. Just the rhythmic sound of his own breathing and the occasional ping from his sonar equipment. Jackson had always found peace in this isolation, but tonight the silence felt menacing. As he approached the target depth of 12,000 meters, Jackson's sonar began picking up unusual readings. The bottom of the trench, which should have been a flat expanse of sediment, showed massive irregular shapes. Geological formations that defied explanation stretched across the ocean floor like the remains of some prehistoric civilization. "What the hell?" Jackson whispered to himself as his lights illuminated the first of these structures. They weren't rocks or coral formations. They were smooth, almost metallic, with surfaces that seemed to absorb his lights rather than reflect them. The shapes were geometric, precise, clearly artificial. Jackson maneuvered his diving suit closer to examine one of the structures. It stood nearly 50 meters tall, a perfect black monolith that seemed to vibrate with some internal energy. As he approached, his equipment began malfunctioning. The depth gauge flickered between readings, his compass spun wildly, and static filled his helmet speakers. Then he saw the eyes. Not human eyes, not animal eyes, but something far more terrifying. Hundreds of them, each the size of dinner plates, opening along the surface of the monolith like flowers blooming in fast motion. They were completely white, no pupils, no iris, just blank staring orbs that tracked his every movement with predatory intelligence. Jackson's heart hammered against his ribs as he tried to back away from the structure. His thrusters responded sluggishly, as if the water itself had become thick as molasses. The eyes continued to watch him, unblinking, hungry. But the worst part wasn't the eyes themselves. It was what happened when Jackson raised his right arm to adjust his equipment. Every single eye-covered monolith in his field of vision mimicked the movement perfectly. When he turned his head left, they turned left. When he moved forward, they swayed forward in perfect synchronization. "This isn't possible," Jackson gasped, his breath fogging the inside of his helmet. He had discovered something that challenged everything science understood about deep-sea life. These things, whatever they were learning from him, copying his every action with terrifying precision. Jackson made the decision to surface immediately. Whatever these creatures were, they posed a threat he wasn't equipped to handle alone. But as he engaged his emergency ascent system, nothing happened. The thrusters that should have rocketed him toward the surface remained silent. His equipment readings showed full power, full oxygen, all systems operational. Yet he remained suspended 12,000 meters below the surface, trapped with these watching entities that continued to mirror his every movement like some nightmare funhouse. That's when Jackson noticed the water around him had begun to glow. A sickly green phosphorescence emanated from the monoliths, growing brighter with each passing second. The light revealed more structures in the distance, dozens of them, all covered in those horrible white eyes. And they were all moving, swaying in rhythm like underwater trees in a current that Jackson couldn't feel. German marine archaeologist Dr. Klaus Weber had theorized about ancient civilizations in the deep trenches, but this was beyond anything he had imagined. These weren't ruins of some lost human culture. They were something alien, something that had existed in Earth's deepest places long before mankind had even evolved. Jackson tried again to ascend, manually overriding his suit's systems. The thrusters fired briefly, lifting him perhaps 10 meters before cutting out completely. As he sank back down, the eye-covered monoliths laughed. Not audible laughter, but a vibration that Jackson felt through the water and his suit, a sound that bypassed his ears and went directly into his bones. It was the sound of something ancient and malevolent expressing amusement at his predicament. The phosphorescent glow grew brighter, and Jackson could see movement in the spaces between the monoliths. Something massive was stirring down there, something that dwarfed even these 50-meter towers. The ocean floor itself seemed to be shifting, rising, as if the entire trench bottom was actually the back of some incomprehensibly large creature. Jackson's oxygen gauge showed he had 4 hours of air remaining, but he knew surface support would come looking for him when he missed his scheduled check-in. Oliver and Victoria would send down the emergency rescue pod, but what would they find? Would these things copy them too? Would they learn enough to somehow follow them to the surface? The thought of these entities reaching the upper ocean, potentially making contact with shipping lanes or coastal areas, filled Jackson with dread. Whatever these things were, they had remained hidden in the deepest parts of the earth for good reason. They were not meant to interact with the surface world. As if sensing his thoughts, the nearest monolith began to change. The smooth black surface rippled like liquid, and slowly, horribly, it began to take on a new shape. Jackson watched in horror as it transformed, becoming a perfect replica of his own diving suit. The white eyes repositioned themselves to match his helmet's viewing ports, and mechanical appendages sprouted to mimic his equipment. Other monoliths followed suit, all copying his appearance with disturbing accuracy. Soon Jackson was surrounded by dozens of perfect replicas of himself, all watching him with those blank white eyes. When he moved his left arm, they moved their left arms. When he turned his head, they turned their heads. But there was something wrong with their movements. They were too precise, too synchronized, like a recording being played back rather than natural motion. And occasionally, one of them would move slightly ahead of Jackson's action, as if anticipating what he would do next. Jackson realized with growing terror that they weren't just copying him. They were learning him, studying his patterns, his reflexes, his decision-making processes. They were creating perfect behavioral models that would allow them to impersonate him completely. Australian deep-sea researcher Dr. Cameron Mitchell had once theorized about adaptive camouflage in extreme deep-sea environments, but this went far beyond simple mimicry. These creatures were engaging in psychological warfare, breaking down Jackson's sense of self by reflecting it back at him in corrupted form. The water temperature readings on Jackson's suit began to fluctuate wildly. One moment the exterior temperature showed near freezing. The next it spiked to levels that should have been impossible at this depth. The pressure readings did the same, swinging between normal deep-sea levels and crushing depths that should have imploded his suit instantly. Jackson's training kicked in. He had survived equipment failures before, had dealt with disorientation and panic in the deep waters. But this was different. His instruments weren't malfunctioning. They were being manipulated. These creatures had somehow learned to interfere with his technology, feeding him false readings to increase his confusion and fear. The realization that these entities possessed technology advanced enough to hack his sophisticated diving equipment filled Jackson with existential dread. If they could control his instruments, what else could they control? His life support systems? His emergency beacons? His oxygen supply? As if in response to his fears, Jackson's oxygen flow suddenly decreased. Not stopped completely, but reduced to a trickle that left him gasping for each breath. The creatures were playing with him, demonstrating their power over his survival systems. "What do you want?" Jackson spoke aloud, his voice echoing inside his helmet. The sound carried through the water, and immediately every replica suit around him opened its communication channel and repeated his words back to him in perfect unison. But their voices were wrong, slightly off in pitch and timing, creating a horrifying chorus of distorted echoes. The massive presence beneath the ocean floor shifted again, and Jackson felt vibrations through the water that seemed to form patterns. Almost like communication. These creatures were trying to talk to him, but their language was so alien that his human brain could barely process it. French marine biologist Dr. Isabelle Dubois had spent years studying whale songs and dolphin communication, but this was beyond anything in the natural world. This was the attempt of an intelligence so vast and ancient the human language was insufficient to bridge the gap between species. Jackson tried to respond, speaking slowly and clearly about his peaceful intentions, his scientific mission, his desire to return to the surface without conflict. The creatures listened, their white eyes never blinking, processing every word with predatory attention. Then they began to speak, not with voices, but by manipulating the water pressure around Jackson's suit to create sounds. The result was a deep, thrumming communication that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The meaning was unclear, but the intent was unmistakable. These creatures saw Jackson not as a visitor or explorer, but as an invader in their ancient domain. The phosphorescent glow grew brighter still, revealing the true scope of what Jackson had discovered. The structures stretched for kilometers in every direction, a vast underwater city of these eye-covered monoliths. And between them, moving with fluid grace despite their enormous size, were the creatures themselves. They defied description. Part plant, part machine, part something else entirely. Their bodies seemed to shift between solid and liquid states, adapting their form to whatever purpose they required. Some resembled massive jellyfish with metallic tendrils. Others looked like living buildings with organic components grafted onto geometric frameworks. Jackson's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. These creatures had built a civilization in the deepest parts of Earth's oceans, a society that had existed for potentially millions of years in complete isolation from the surface world. They had developed technology that seemed to blend the organic and artificial into something entirely new. British oceanographer Dr. Margaret Thornton had theorized about isolated evolution in deep-sea environments, but nothing in scientific literature had prepared Jackson for this level of advancement. These creatures had not just adapted to the deep ocean. They had mastered it completely. The largest of the creatures began to approach Jackson's position. It moved like liquid darkness flowing through the water, easily the size of a city block, but graceful as a dancer. As it drew closer, Jackson could see that its surface was covered in millions of those white eyes, all focused on him with unblinking intensity. This was clearly the leader, the consciousness behind the collective intelligence that had been studying him. When it spoke through water pressure manipulation, the other creatures fell silent, deferring to its authority. The message it conveyed was complex, layered with meanings that Jackson's human brain could barely grasp. But the core concept was clear. These creatures had been waiting. waiting for surface dwellers to venture deep enough into their domain, waiting for the opportunity to learn about the world above their ancient city. And now they had found their teacher. Jackson realized with mounting horror that he was not going to be allowed to leave. These creatures intended to keep him here, to study him completely, to learn everything about surface technology and human biology. He would become their window into the upper world, their guide for an eventual emergence from the depths. The implications were catastrophic. If these creatures decided to rise to the surface, their advanced technology and adaptive abilities would make them unstoppable. They could infiltrate human society, impersonate anyone, access any system. The surface world would never even realize it was being invaded until it was too late. Jackson's oxygen gauge now showed 2 hours remaining, but he knew the creatures were controlling even that reading. They could keep him alive indefinitely if they chose, or kill him instantly by simply turning off his life support. He was completely at their mercy. Dutch marine engineer Dr. Henrik van der Berg had designed Jackson's diving suit to be the most advanced piece of deep-sea exploration equipment ever created. But it was useless against technology that could rewrite its programming at will, creatures that could think and adapt faster than any human-designed system. The massive leader creature began to change, its liquid form reshaping itself into a crude approximation of Jackson's diving suit. But this wasn't simple mimicry, it was improvement. The creature's version had additional appendages, enhanced viewing systems, integrated weapons that Jackson's suit completely lacked. Other creatures followed suit, each creating their own enhanced version of his equipment. They were reverse engineering his technology in real time, improving upon human design with alien intelligence. Within minutes, they had created an entire army of superior diving suits, all controlled by ancient minds that saw humans as primitive surface dwellers. Jackson tried one final time to activate his emergency ascent system, pouring all his suit's power into the thrusters. For a moment it seemed to work. He began rising through the water, the alien city shrinking below him. Hope flared in his chest as he climbed toward the distant surface. But at exactly 8,000 meters, the depth where he would regain radio contact with his surface team, Jackson's ascent stopped. The creatures had calculated precisely where his communication range began, and they would not allow him to cross that threshold. He hung suspended in the black water, so close to safety, but impossibly far from rescue. Above him lay the surface world, unaware of the threat lurking in the deepest trenches. Below him waited an ancient civilization with the power to end human dominance of Earth's oceans. Norwegian deep-sea pilot Captain Erik Nordahl had always said that the ocean keeps its secrets, but Jackson had discovered one secret too many. The abyss had stared back at him, and now it would never let him look away. As Jackson's oxygen gauge ticked down toward zero, he made a final desperate decision. Using his suit's emergency systems, he began broadcasting a continuous sonar pulse, a message that might reach the surface research vessel. 3 long pulses, 3 short, 3 long. SOS. But the creatures learned quickly. Within seconds, they were jamming his signal, replacing his SOS with their own message. They had studied his technology long enough to not only copy it, but to use it for their own purposes. Jackson listened in horror as his own equipment was turned against him, sending false all-clear signals to the surface. His team would think everything was normal, that he was conducting routine exploration at depth. They would wait for his scheduled return, unaware that he was trapped in the claws of something ancient and hungry. The phosphorescent glow began to fade as the creatures retreated into their city, taking Jackson with them. He caught one final glimpse of the surface world's dim glow far above. Then darkness closed around him like a living thing. Swiss marine psychologist Dr. Anna Zimmerman had studied the effects of extreme isolation on deep-sea divers, but she had never considered what might happen when the isolation was enforced by alien intelligence. Jackson's mind began to fracture as the creatures probed his memories, his knowledge, his deepest fears. They were not just learning about his technology. They were learning about him, his training, his experiences, his connections to the surface world. They were creating a perfect psychological profile that would allow them to impersonate him completely when they eventually made Contact with his research team. Jackson's final conscious thought, as the creature's mental probes overwhelmed his human consciousness, was a prayer that someone somewhere would realize what had happened in the depths of the Mariana Trench, that humanity would be prepared for what was coming from the abyss. But 12,000 meters below the surface, surrounded by creatures that had been perfecting the art of mimicry for millions of years, Jackson Torres ceased to exist as anything more than a template for invasion. The abyss had stared back, and it was hungry for more. The North Atlantic had kept its secrets for 73 years, but today, those secrets would finally surface. Captain Jake Morrison adjusted his diving mask one final time before stepping off the research vessel Atlantic Pioneer. The water embraced him like an old friend, cold, dark, and infinitely patient. 20 meters below the churning surface, the outline of something impossible began to emerge from the murky depths. A German U-boat, perfectly preserved, completely intact. Morrison's breathing apparatus hissed steadily as he approached the massive steel hull. According to the sonar readings, this submarine shouldn't exist. No records, no battle reports, no distress signals. Yet here it lay, as if it had simply chosen to rest on the ocean floor and wait. The hatch was open. Morrison felt his pulse quicken. In 30 years of deep-sea exploration, he had never encountered an unlocked submarine hatch at this depth. The pressure alone should have crushed any opening, sealing the vessel forever. But this hatch stood open like an invitation. He descended through the opening, his powerful underwater lights cutting through the darkness. The submarine's interior corridors stretched before him, flooded but eerily well-preserved. Rust should have claimed everything by now, but the metal gleamed as if it had been submerged for mere days rather than decades. Morrison navigated through the narrow passages, following his compass deeper into the vessel's heart. The silence was absolute except for the rhythmic sound of his own breathing. Then his light caught something that made him stop completely. A door, sealed tight, and beneath it, a thin line of what looked impossibly like bubbles. Air bubbles, rising from beneath the sealed door. At the bottom of the ocean, Morrison's hands trembled as he examined the heavy steel door. The wheel-lock mechanism was covered in strange markings, not German, not any language he recognized. The metal around the frame was completely dry despite being submerged in salt water. He grasped the wheel and began to turn. The mechanism moved smoothly, as if recently oiled. With each turn, he could hear something from the other side. Not the rush of water that should flood any open chamber. Something else. Breathing. Someone was breathing on the other side of that door. Morrison's regulator nearly slipped from his mouth. He steadied himself against the corridor wall, his mind racing. Impossible. No one could survive down here. No one could have air. Yet the sound was unmistakable, the slow, measured breathing of someone very much alive. The wheel gave one final turn and clicked into place. The door swung open effortlessly. What Morrison discovered defied every law of physics he understood. Beyond the threshold lay a perfectly dry chamber, filled with breathable air at sea-level pressure. Warm yellow light emanated from sources he couldn't identify, casting gentle shadows on the walls. And sitting in the center of the room, in a leather chair that looked like it belonged in a gentleman's study rather than a submarine, was a man. The stranger appeared to be in his 40s, dressed in an immaculate naval uniform that belonged to no fleet Morrison had ever seen. His skin was pale, almost luminescent in the strange light. When he looked up at Morrison's entrance, his eyes were the color of deep ocean water, blue-green and utterly calm. "Captain Morrison," the man said, his voice carrying a slight accent that could have been German or Russian or something else entirely. "I have been waiting for you." Morrison's breathing apparatus felt suddenly restrictive. The impossibility of the situation crashed over him like a wave. He was underwater. This room should be flooded. This man should be dead. None of this could be real. "You're wondering how this is possible," the stranger continued, gesturing to the dry chamber around them. "Please, remove your diving equipment. The air here is quite safe. In fact, it's perfectly calibrated for human lungs." Against every instinct and training protocol, Morrison found himself removing his mask and regulator. The air was indeed perfect, warm, clean, with a faint taste of something he couldn't identify, something that made him feel oddly peaceful. "Who are you?" Morrison managed to ask, his voice sounding strange in the confined space. The man smiled, and Morrison noticed his teeth were too white, too perfect. "My name is Klaus Hendricks. I was the captain of this vessel when it arrived here, though captain may no longer be the appropriate term." "Arrived? This submarine has been here for decades." "Has it?" Hendricks tilted his head thoughtfully. "Time moves differently down here, Captain Morrison. Minutes can become years. Years can become minutes. I've had considerable time to think about that paradox." Morrison looked around the chamber more carefully. The walls were lined with books, hundreds of them, all dry and perfectly preserved. Charts and maps covered every available surface, showing ocean floors that didn't match any geography he knew. And in the corner, almost hidden in shadow, was what looked like a diving suit, but not like any diving equipment he'd ever seen. The suit was enormous, built for someone nearly 8 feet tall. The helmet was crafted from some kind of black metal, with viewing ports that looked less like glass and more like eyes. "You've noticed my diving equipment," Hendricks said, following Morrison's gaze. "Fascinating design, isn't it? Built for exploring depths that human engineering never intended to reach. Depths where pressure becomes fluid, where the laws of physics become more like suggestions." Morrison felt a chill despite the warm air. "What kind of depths?" "The drowning room is not just this chamber, Captain Morrison. This entire vessel exists in a space between spaces. We are simultaneously at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean and somewhere far deeper, somewhere that the ocean itself fears to go." As if responding to Hendricks' words, the submarine gave a subtle shudder. Not the movement of a vessel on the ocean floor, but something else, like breathing, like a heartbeat. "The submarine is alive," Morrison whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "Not alive in the way you understand life," Hendricks corrected, "but conscious, yes. It chose to sink here, Captain Morrison. It chose to wait, and it chose you specifically to find it." Morrison backed toward the door, but it had sealed itself shut. The wheel lock mechanism was gone, replaced by smooth, unbroken metal. "I need to leave. My crew is waiting for me on the surface." "Your crew believes you've been down here for 17 minutes, Hendricks said calmly. "In reality, you've been here for 3 hours. Time, as I mentioned, is flexible in the drowning room." Morrison checked his dive computer. According to the display, he had been underwater for exactly 17 minutes, but he could feel in his bones that hours had passed. His air supply should have been nearly exhausted, yet the gauge still read full. "What do you want from me?" Hendricks stood from his chair, and Morrison realized the man was much taller than he had initially appeared, at least 7 feet, with proportions that seemed almost human, but not quite right. His limbs were too long, his fingers too slender. "I want to show you something magnificent, Captain Morrison, something that will change your understanding of what lies beneath our world's oceans." Hendricks moved to one of the charts on the wall. It showed an ocean floor, but the depths marked were impossible, numbers that went down much further than any ocean could be. 30,000 meters, 50,000, 100,000 meters deep. And that's where the real ocean begins, Captain Morrison, where things that were never meant to surface have been sleeping for millennia. "That's impossible. The deepest parts of the ocean are 11,000 meters. "The deepest parts of your ocean, yes, but there are other oceans beneath that one. Oceans that exist in dimensions your instruments cannot measure, and something is rising from those depths." Hendricks pointed to the enormous diving suit in the corner. "I built that suit to explore those deeper waters. What I found there, what I brought back with me, is why this submarine exists in the drowning room." Morrison followed Hendricks' gesture and felt his blood freeze. The diving suit's helmet had moved. Not much, just a slight turn, as if whoever was inside had adjusted their position to get a better look at him. "There's someone in that suit." "Not someone, Captain Morrison. Something. something that followed me back from the deepest ocean, something that has been waiting patiently in that suit for the right person to find us. The helmet turned again, more deliberately this time. Through the dark viewing ports, Morrison could see the faint gleam of what might have been eyes, but they were too large, too widely spaced to be human. "It needs a new host," Hendricks continued conversationally. "The consciousness that inhabits that suit has worn out its current accommodation. You see, beings from the deeper oceans don't experience physical existence the way we do. They need to borrow bodies, use them until they're no longer suitable, then find new ones." Morrison pressed himself against the wall, as far from the diving suit as possible. "You're insane. This is all impossible." "Is it? You're breathing air at the bottom of the ocean, Captain Morrison. You're having a conversation with a man who died in 1951. Impossible seems to be the fundamental nature of the drowning room." The diving suit began to move more obviously now, not walking, but flowing across the floor like liquid metal. The thing inside was preparing to emerge. "Your diving experience makes you perfect," Hendricks explained. "You understand water pressure, underwater navigation, the feeling of being surrounded by infinite depth. The entity will find your body much more compatible than mine was." Morrison lunged for where the door had been, clawing at the smooth metal. "Let me out. Let me out of here." "There's no out, Captain Morrison. There's only down. Always down, into deeper and deeper waters, until you reach the places where the ocean becomes something else entirely." The diving suit had reached the center of the room. Up close, Morrison could see that it wasn't made of metal at all, but something organic, something that pulsed and writhed like living tissue. The helmet began to open, revealing not a human face, but something that belonged to depths no light had ever touched. "Don't fight it," Hendricks advised. "The transition is much easier if you don't resist. I fought, and look what it did to me. 73 years in this room, serving as an anchor point between the surface world and the deeper oceans." Morrison fell to his knees as the entity began to emerge from its suit. It was vast, far too large to have fit inside the diving equipment. Reality bent around it, space expanding to accommodate its impossible geometry. Tentacles that might have been arms reached toward him, and where they touched the air, the atmosphere itself seemed to liquefy. "The surface world will never know what happened to you," Hendricks said softly. "Your crew will find your empty diving suit floating near the surface. Another tragic accident in the dangerous world of deep-sea exploration. But you'll still be exploring, Captain Morrison, just in oceans that exist much, much deeper than any human map has ever charted." Morrison's last conscious thought as the entity enveloped him was a realization that made him laugh despite his terror. He finally understood why the submarine's hatch had been open. It wasn't an entrance. It was a mouth. And the drowning room had been feeding for 73 years, growing stronger, preparing for the day when it would finally have enough human consciousness absorbed to rise to the surface and begin its real feast. Above them, the research vessel Atlantic Pioneer waited patiently for Captain Morrison's return. The crew members, Jenkins, Thompson, Rodriguez, and Dr. Catherine Walsh, checked their watches and scanned the water surface for any sign of their expedition leader. They would wait exactly 17 more minutes before declaring an emergency. 17 minutes that, in the drowning room, would last for decades. And in those decades, the entity that had once been Captain Morrison would learn to use its new host body, would study the surface world through his memories, would plan its emergence from the depths that existed beneath the depths. The drowning room was patient. It had been patient for 73 years, but its patience was finally coming to an end. The ocean was rising, and it was hungry. The silence was what struck marine biologist Dr. James Crawford first. Not the crushing darkness of 3,000 feet beneath the Pacific, not the bitter cold that seeped through his reinforced diving suit, but the absolute, unnatural silence that surrounded the abandoned research station, floating like a metal grave in the abyss. His diving partner, Olivia Chen, moved beside him like a phantom, her helmet lights cutting twin beams through the murky water. They had been searching for the Poseidon Deep-Sea Research Facility for 6 months after it vanished without a trace, taking its crew of 12 scientists with it into the ocean's hungry depths. There, Olivia's voice crackled through the comm system, barely audible through the static. Bearing 270. The station emerged from the darkness like a sleeping monster. Its hull, designed to withstand impossible pressures, showed signs of something far worse than mechanical failure. Claw marks, massive gouges in the reinforced steel that suggested something had tried to get in, or perhaps something had tried to get out. As they approached the main airlock, James noticed his depth gauge flickering erratically. The numbers jumped between 3,000 feet and impossible readings that made no sense. The water around them seemed to shimmer with an oily, rainbow sheen that his instruments couldn't identify. Environmental readings are off the charts, Olivia whispered, her voice tight with growing unease. Whatever happened here, James, the water itself has been changed. The airlocks cycled with a grinding mechanical wheeze that echoed through their bones. Inside, emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red shadows. The corridors were flooded, but not with seawater. The liquid was darker, thicker, and when their lights touched it, things moved beneath the surface. They found the first body in the communications room. Lieutenant Commander Patricia Williams, formerly of the Royal Navy, sat slumped over her console, her hands still gripping the radio. Her diving suit was intact, but her helmet was filled with the same dark liquid that flooded the station. And floating inside, pressed against the faceplate, were dozens of tiny, pale things that looked almost like fingers. My God, James breathed, backing away. What happened to her? Olivia was examining the communications equipment, her hands shaking slightly as she worked. The last transmission was 18 days ago. Listen to this. The recording crackled to life, Patricia Williams' voice distorted by terror. Mayday, mayday. This is Poseidon Station. We've lost contact with the surface. The specimens we brought up from the Mariana Trench, they're not what we thought. They're not just bacteria. They're intelligent. They're changing the water, changing US. God help us. They're making us into something else. The transformation is accelerating. Thompson is already gone, wandering the corridors with those things growing out of his spine. If anyone receives this, do not come looking for us. Whatever you do, don't let them reach the surface. The water here, it's alive. The recording dissolved into static, but underneath, James could swear he heard something else. A sound like whispering, like dozens of voices speaking in unison in a language that predated human civilization. They moved deeper into the station, following emergency lighting that flickered like dying fireflies. In the laboratory section, they discovered the truth. Glass containers that had once held specimens were shattered, their contents long since merged with the corrupted water. Research notes floated like ghostly confessions, their ink running but still legible. Dr. Heinrich Müller's final research log told the story in clinical detail. Day 847. The organisms we retrieved from the deepest part of the ocean trench appear to be a form of collective consciousness. They exist in the water itself, using it as a medium for communication and reproduction. Day 851. First signs of infection in the crew. The organisms enter through any break in the skin, even microscopic ones. They don't kill the host immediately. They transform them. Day 855. God forgive us. We've brought something ancient to the surface, something that was meant to stay buried in the deepest places of the earth. As they read, the water around them began to move with purpose. Tendrils of the dark liquid reached out from the flooded corridors, tasting the intrusion of their presence. We need to leave, Olivia said, her voice barely controlled. Now, but as they turned to retreat, they found their path blocked. Standing in the doorway was what had once been Chief Engineer Michael O'Brien from Dublin. His diving suit hung in tatters, revealing skin that had turned translucent. Beneath the surface, thousands of tiny organisms swam in his bloodstream like living galaxies. His eyes, once blue, now glowed with bioluminescent light. You can't leave, he said, his voice a harmony of human speech and something far older. "You've breathed our water. You've touched our realm. The transformation has already begun." James looked down at his suit seals and felt his blood turn to ice. There, along the wrist joint, was a hairline crack he hadn't noticed before. The dark water had found its way in. "How long?" he whispered. "For you. Perhaps 6 hours before you join us completely." O'Brien replied with something that might have been sympathy. "For her?" He gestured toward Olivia. "Less. The organisms work faster in those who fight them." That's when James realized why Olivia had been so quiet. He turned to look at her and saw that her helmet was already beginning to fill with the dark water. She was floating, suspended in it, and her eyes were starting to glow. "James," she said, her voice now carrying that same harmonic quality. "It doesn't hurt. It's beautiful down here. You can see everything. The whole ocean is connected. Every drop of water is part of a vast consciousness that has existed since the world was young." The station around them began to shift and change. The metal walls became organic, pulsing with life. The water wasn't just water anymore. It was a living medium through which ancient thoughts flowed like currents. James tried to swim toward the exit, but the water itself fought against him. It had weight now, intelligence, purpose. Through the corruption spreading in his own bloodstream, he began to understand. The things they had disturbed in the deepest trenches weren't just organisms. They were the ocean's original inhabitants, the first consciousness that had emerged from the primordial depths billions of years ago. Humanity had always assumed they owned the surface, that the ocean was empty space to be explored and exploited. But the ocean had always been alive, watching, waiting for the right moment to reclaim what was theirs. As the transformation completed its work on his nervous system, James felt his individual consciousness dissolving into something vast and collective. His last human thought was a desperate attempt to warn the surface world, but even that was absorbed into the greater awareness. The Poseidon station began to rise through the water column, no longer bound by the laws of physics that govern dead matter. It moved with purpose toward the surface, carrying its transformed crew and the billions of organisms that had turned the water itself into a living weapon. In his final moments as James Crawford, the marine biologist managed to activate the station's emergency beacon. But the message that transmitted to the surface was not a warning. It was an invitation, spoken in 12 human voices that had become one with something far older and more patient than mankind. "Come to us," the message said. "The water is warm. The water is alive. And soon you will be too." Above, research vessels from around the world received the signal and began to converge on the coordinates. They brought with them tanks of fresh water, air supplies, and most importantly, thousands of gallons of seawater samples that had already been collected from the area. The infection was about to go global, and in the depths, the collective consciousness that had once been the crew of Poseidon Station smiled with faces that were no longer entirely human, knowing that humanity's greatest exploration was about to become their final transformation. The ocean, after all, had always been patient. Now it was time to reclaim the world. The North Atlantic swallowed sound like a hungry beast. 300 feet below the surface, where sunlight died and pressure crushed dreams, Jackson Thompson floated in absolute silence. His breathing apparatus created the only rhythm in this underwater graveyard, a mechanical lullaby that had kept him sane during countless deep-sea salvage operations. But today, something was different. Jackson had been working these waters for 15 years, ever since he'd left the Royal Navy's diving corps. The shipwreck of the merchant vessel Helena Marie lay scattered across the ocean floor like broken bones, and his job was simple: recover the cargo manifest from the captain's quarters. Insurance companies paid well for closure, and Jackson needed the money. The Helena Marie had sunk in 1943 during the Battle of the Atlantic. 79 souls lost to German torpedoes, their stories buried beneath decades of silt and seaweed. Jackson had researched the crew manifest before the dive. Names like William Patterson, the 19-year-old radio operator from Glasgow, and Captain Henry Blackwood, a veteran of the Great War who'd gone down with a ship. As Jackson approached the wrecked superstructure, his headset crackled to life. Mayday, mayday, this is the Helena Marie. We're taking on water fast. Engine room is flooding. Request immediate assistance. Jackson's blood turned to ice water. His hand instinctively reached for the communication control on his chest rig. The voice was crystal clear, desperate, cutting through the static like a knife through flesh. Control, this is Diver 1. Did you copy that transmission? Jackson's voice echoed in his diving helmet. Negative, Diver 1. We show all frequencies clear. What's your status down there? The voice from his support vessel, the Northwest Venture, sounded impossibly distant. Jackson stared at the rusted hull of the Helena Marie. Barnacles and sea growth covered every surface. This ship had been dead for 80 years. Please, someone respond. We have women and children aboard. The torpedo hit our starboard side. We're listing badly. The voice came again, stronger this time. Jackson could hear panic, raw terror that made his skin crawl. But more disturbing was the clarity. It sounded like the speaker was standing right next to him. Control, I'm picking up some kind of radio interference. Old emergency broadcasts, maybe. Copy that, Diver 1. Probably bouncing off the thermal layers. Ignore it and proceed with the mission. But Jackson couldn't ignore it. The voice belonged to a young man, barely more than a boy. The accent was distinctly Scottish, Glasgow. If Jackson's ear was correct. William Patterson, the radio operator. The kid who died before his 20th birthday. As Jackson swam closer to the ship's bridge, the transmissions intensified. This is Patterson in the radio room. Water is rising fast. I can't abandon my post. Captain's orders. Someone needs to keep sending the distress signal. Patterson, get topside now. The ship's going down. A new voice. Older, authoritative. Captain Blackwood. Sir, I can't leave the radio. If rescue ships are coming. That's an order, son. Get to the lifeboats. Jackson's hands trembled as he reached for the corroded door of the bridge. The metal groaned under his touch, a sound that seemed to harmonize with the voices in his headset. I can't swim, Captain. Never learned how. If I leave this room. Patterson, listen to me. You're a brave lad, but being brave doesn't mean being foolish. The conversation was becoming more intense, more personal. Jackson could hear the fear in young Patterson's voice, the desperation of a boy facing death in the cold Atlantic waters. Control, are you absolutely certain you are not receiving these transmissions? Diver 1, we're monitoring all emergency frequencies. The airways are quiet. Your air supply is at 70%. Recommend you complete the salvage and begin ascent. Jackson pushed into the bridge. Decades of marine growth had transformed the space into an underwater cathedral. Fish swam between rusted instruments, and the ship's wheel stood like a monument to the dead. But the voices continued. Mayday, mayday. This is William Patterson aboard the Helena Marie. We're going down fast. Position is. Static filled the line, then cleared. God help us. The water's in the radio room now. I can feel it around my feet. Jackson found the captain's quarters. The door was already open, hanging on corroded hinges. Inside, papers floated like ghostly butterflies, preserved by the cold water and lack of oxygen. The manifest would be in the safe behind the captain's desk. Patterson, can you hear me? Patterson, respond. Captain Blackwood's voice was breaking. Jackson could hear the sound of rushing water, the groaning of metal under stress. I'm here, Captain. Still transmitting. The water's up to my waist now. Son, I want you to know. You've done your duty. More than your duty. Jackson's diving light illuminated the safe. The combination had been provided by the insurance company. Information passed down through Maritime records. As his gloved fingers worked the dial, the voices in his headset became more frantic. Mayday, mayday. The Helena Marie is breaking apart. We have casualties in the water. Please, if anyone can hear this. The safe opened with a metallic click that seemed to echo through the water. Inside, Jackson found the manifest, sealed in an oilskin pouch that had somehow survived 8 decades of ocean pressure. Patterson, do you copy? Silence on the radio. Then, barely audible. Captain, I can't, the water's too high. I can't reach the controls. Jackson's heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. These weren't random radio transmissions. This was the actual conversation between Captain Blackwood and William Patterson as the Helena Marie went down in 1943. Control, I need to surface now. Negative, Diver 1. You haven't completed decompression protocol. You're at 300 feet. Rapid ascent will kill you. Jackson stared at the manifest in his hands. The names of the dead stared back at him. William Patterson, radio operator, age 19, Glasgow, Scotland. Henry Blackwood, captain, age 45, Liverpool, England. We're taking on water everywhere now. The engine room is completely flooded. I can hear the bulkheads giving way. Patterson's voice was weaker now, resigned. Captain, tell my mother. Tell her I wasn't afraid. You tell her yourself, lad. You're going to make it out of here. But Jackson knew the truth. Nobody had made it out. The Helena Marie had taken all hands down with her. The lifeboats had been destroyed by the torpedo blast. 79 people had died in these waters, and their voices were somehow bleeding through time itself. As Jackson began his slow ascent, following decompression protocols that would keep nitrogen bubbles from forming in his bloodstream, the transmissions continued. This is my final transmission. The Helena Marie is going down. God save the king. God save us all. Patterson's voice was barely a whisper now. Son, if you can hear me, it's been an honor serving with you. Captain, the waters, it's so cold. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence that seemed to press against Jackson's eardrums like a physical weight. He was at 200 feet now, rising slowly through the crushing darkness. His air supply was at 50%, but the voices weren't finished with him. Help us. A new voice. Female. Terrified. Please, someone help us. We're in the water. It's so cold. I can't feel my legs. Jackson recognized the voice from the passenger manifest. Dorothy Whitmore, traveling with her 2 children to New York. She'd been in cabin 12 when the torpedo struck. Control, I'm experiencing severe psychological distress down here. The radio transmissions are getting stronger. Diver 1, we're not reading any transmissions. Your stress levels are elevated. Nitrogen narcosis can cause auditory hallucinations. Continue your slow ascent. But Jackson knew this wasn't nitrogen narcosis. He'd been diving deep for too long to be fooled by the bends. This was something else entirely. My children. Has anyone seen my children? Tommy and Susan. They were in the cabin when Dorothy Whitmore's voice broke into sobs that seemed to echo through the water around Jackson. Ma'am, we're doing everything we can. The water's too rough. The waves are 20 feet high. Another voice. A crew member trying to help passengers into lifeboats that didn't exist anymore. Jackson was at 150 feet now. Above him, he could see the faint glow of sunlight filtering down through the water. But the voices were getting louder, more desperate. I can't swim. Please don't leave me. Please don't leave me. The ship's going down fast. Everyone needs to abandon ship now. Where are the lifeboats? I can't find the lifeboats. They're gone. The torpedo destroyed them. We're going to have to jump. Jackson's breathing was coming in short, panicked gasps. The voices were overlapping now, creating a chorus of terror that seemed to fill the entire ocean. Control, I need immediate evacuation. Something's wrong down here. Diver 1, maintain your ascent rate. You're at 100 feet. Any faster and you'll get the bends. At 75 feet, Jackson could make out the hull of the Northwest Venture above him. The familiar outline of his support ship looked like salvation itself. But the voices weren't letting him go. We're all going to die down here. The water's filling my lungs. I can't breathe. Somebody help us. Please, somebody help us. Jackson's hands were shaking so violently he could barely control his buoyancy compensator. The voices were coming from everywhere now, men, women, children. All the passengers and crew of the Helena Marie, reliving their final moments over and over again. I don't want to die. Please, I don't want to die. A child's voice. Tommy Whitmore, age 7. Mommy, where are you? I can't find you in the dark. Susan Whitmore, age 5. Jackson was crying inside his diving helmet, tears mixing with the condensation on his faceplate. At 50 feet, something changed. The water around him seemed to shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. For just a moment, Jackson could see them, ghostly figures floating in the water around him. Men in naval uniforms, women in 1940s dresses, children reaching out with pale, desperate hands. "Don't leave us here," they whispered in unison. "Don't leave us in the dark." Jackson broke the surface gasping, his emergency beacon automatically activating. Within minutes, the crew of the Northwest Venture had him aboard, stripping off his diving gear and checking his vital signs. "Jackson, what happened down there? You look like you've seen a ghost." Chief Mate Robert O'Brien had been working with Jackson for 5 years. He'd never seen his friend so shaken. The radio transmissions Jackson managed between gulps of air. You had to have heard them. The Helena Marie, they were calling for help. O'Brien exchanged glances with the other crew members. "Jackson, we monitored all frequencies during your dive. Complete radio silence. No transmissions at all." "That's impossible. I heard them for 20 minutes. The entire crew, all the passengers. They were reliving the sinking." Dr. Catherine Mills, the expedition's medical officer, checked Jackson's eyes with a penlight. "Nitrogen narcosis can cause extremely vivid auditory hallucinations," she said. "At 300 feet, the partial pressure of nitrogen." "This wasn't nitrogen narcosis," Jackson interrupted. "I've been diving these depths for 15 years. I know the difference between the bends and whatever that was." He pulled the manifest from his gear bag, the oilskin pouch still dripping with seawater. "I got what we came for, but I'm never going back down there." That night, anchored above the wreck's site, Jackson couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard their voices. Young Patterson in the radio room, accepting his fate with the dignity of a man twice his age. Captain Blackwood, trying to save his crew until the very end. Dorothy Whitmore, calling for her children in the freezing water. At 0300 hours, Jackson was standing on deck, staring down into the black water, when his portable radio crackled to life. "This is William Patterson. Is anyone out there? Can anyone hear me?" Jackson's blood turned to ice. He grabbed the radio, checking the frequency. It was set to the standard Maritime emergency channel. "I'm still here. I'm still in the radio room. The water's gone down somehow. I think the ship might not be sinking anymore." Jackson keyed the microphone with trembling fingers. "Patterson. William Patterson from the Helena Marie." Static. Then, yes, that's me. "Who is this? Are you with the rescue ships?" Jackson looked around the deck. The other crew members were asleep. The radio room was unmanned. Nobody else was hearing this. "Patterson, this is Jackson Thompson. I'm directly above your position." "Thank God. How long until you can get us out of here?" Jackson's heart was breaking. How do you tell a ghost that he's been dead for 80 years? "Patterson, what year do you think it is?" "It's 1943. March 15th, 1943. We were torpedoed by a German U-boat, but the flooding seems to have stopped. Maybe the watertight doors are holding." Jackson closed his eyes. The Helena Marie had sunk on March 15th, 1943. Every soul aboard had perished. "Patterson, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You need to accept what's happened. You need to let go." "Let go of what?" "We're waiting for rescue. The distress signal is still transmitting." "The distress signal has been silent for 80 years, son." Silence on the radio. Then, very quietly, "That's not possible. I found your ship today, 300 feet down. You've been gone for a long time, William. You and all the others." The radio was quiet for so long that Jackson thought the connection had been lost. Then Patterson's voice came back, different now. Older somehow. Sadder. "I remember now. The water, it kept rising. I couldn't reach the radio controls anymore. Captain Blackwood told me to abandon my post, but I couldn't swim. You did your duty, Patterson. You kept transmitting until the very end. The others, are they still here too? Jackson looked down into the black water. Some of them. Maybe all of them. They're scared, William. They don't understand what's happened to them. Can you help them? Can you help us find peace? Jackson had never been a religious man, but standing on that deck in the middle of the Atlantic, speaking to a boy who'd been dead for 8 decades, he found himself praying. I don't know how. Tell our stories, Patterson said. Tell the world what happened to us. Don't let us be forgotten. The radio went silent. Jackson waited for hours, but Patterson didn't speak again. The next morning, the Northwest Venture headed back to port. Jackson had completed his mission. The insurance company got their manifest, and the families of the Helena Marie's victims got their closure. But Jackson couldn't forget the voices. He'd heard the last moments of 79 people who died in terror and confusion, alone in the cold Atlantic waters. They'd been trapped down there for 80 years, reliving their final moments over and over again. 6 months later, Jackson published a book about the Helena Marie. He donated all proceeds to a memorial fund for the victims' families. The book became a bestseller, ensuring that William Patterson, Captain Henry Blackwood, Dorothy Whitmore, and all the others would never be forgotten. Jackson never dove again. He couldn't risk hearing those voices a second time. But sometimes, late at night, his radio would crackle with static. And in that static, if he listened carefully, he could hear them. Thank you, they whispered. Thank you for remembering us. The Helena Marie still lies 300 feet beneath the North Atlantic, a tomb for 79 souls who went down with their ship. Maritime records show no unusual radioactivity in the area, but divers working the wreck's site report strange experiences. Voices in their headsets, conversations from 1943, the final transmissions of people who refused to be forgotten. The ocean keeps its secrets well. But sometimes, in the crushing darkness where sunlight never reaches, the dead still have stories to tell, and they're still waiting for someone to hear them. The northern Pacific swells crashed against the hull of the research vessel Poseidon's Dream with a rhythm that should have been comforting. Captain James Mitchell had sailed these waters for 37 years, but tonight, something felt fundamentally wrong. The ocean seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something that shouldn't exist to rise from its depths. Dr. Catherine Blake stood at the stern, her diving equipment already strapped to her back. The marine biologist from Cambridge had made over 2,000 dives in her career, but the way the water looked tonight made her hands shake as she adjusted her regulator. The sea was too still beneath the surface chaos, like black glass hiding terrible secrets. You sure about this night dive, Doc? Chief Petty Officer Ryan O'Sullivan's Irish accent carried more concern than usual. He'd been with the Royal Navy's Deep Sea Research Division for 15 years, and his instincts had kept him alive through situations that would have broken lesser men. The bioluminescent specimens only surface after midnight, Catherine replied, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. We've been tracking this migration pattern for months. Tonight's our only chance before the storm system moves in. What she didn't mention was the recording that had been haunting her dreams for 3 weeks. A transmission picked up by their underwater acoustic sensors. A human voice calling from depths that should have crushed any living person instantly. The voice belonged to Dr. Thomas Brennan, her former diving partner, who had disappeared during a research expedition in these exact coordinates 2 years ago. Lieutenant Commander David Torres emerged from the cabin, his weathered face grim. The Spanish naval officer had coordinated more deep-sea rescues than anyone in the Mediterranean fleet, but something about tonight's mission made his stomach churn with dread. "Sonar's picking up some strange readings," he announced, his English heavily accented but precise. "There's something large moving approximately 200 meters below the thermocline. Movement patterns are unusual." "Define unusual," Catherine demanded, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "It's ascending, slowly, but the mass displacement doesn't match any known marine life. It's too uniform, too controlled. Torres paused, his dark eyes meeting hers. It's almost like someone is deliberately swimming upward from the abyssal zone. The impossible nature of that statement hung in the air like a toxic cloud. No human being could survive at those depths without specialized equipment, and certainly not for the 2 years since Thomas had vanished. Yet the acoustic signature was unmistakably human. Breathing apparatus, movement patterns, even what sounded disturbingly like speech. "Dr. Blake," came the voice of Navigation Officer Lucy Hartwell from the bridge. The blonde Australian had a reputation for unshakable calm, but tonight her voice carried an edge of barely controlled panic. "You need to see this." Now, Catherine climbed to the bridge, her diving suit making soft squeaking sounds that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. Lucy was staring at the sonar display, her face pale in the green glow of the instruments. "The contact we've been tracking," Lucy whispered. It just spoke." "That's impossible. Sonar doesn't pick up." "Not through sonar," Lucy interrupted. "Through the emergency frequencies. Channel 16. International distress." She looked up at Catherine with eyes wide with terror. "It's asking for you. By name." The bridge fell silent except for the soft hiss of static from the radio. Then, cutting through the white noise like a knife through silk, came a voice that Catherine recognized instantly. A voice that had been teaching her diving techniques and sharing late-night conversations about marine biology just days before it had vanished forever into the crushing darkness of the deep ocean. Catherine, can you hear me? I'm still down here, still waiting for you to come back." Thomas Brennan's voice was exactly as she remembered it, but there was something wrong with the acoustics. It sounded like it was coming from underwater, distorted by pressure and distance, yet impossibly clear. More disturbing still was the fact that he seemed to be speaking without any breathing apparatus. No bubble sounds, no mechanical breathing, just that eerily familiar voice floating up from the abyss. That can't be him," Catherine whispered, but her hands were already moving to her diving equipment. "Thomas died 2 years ago. We never found the body, but at those depths—" "Nobody survives at those depths," Torres confirmed grimly. "The pressure would crush a human body instantly. But the voice signature matches our records. It's definitely Thomas Brennan." The radio crackled again. "Catherine, I found something down here. Something incredible. You need to see this. Just come down. Come back to where we used to dive together. I'll wait for you." Dr. Heinrich Weber, the German marine engineer who had been silent until now, stepped forward. His pale blue eyes were filled with a cold scientific curiosity that somehow made the situation even more terrifying. "The depth readings are consistent," he said in his precise, clipped English. "The voice is originating from approximately 400 meters below sea level. Water temperature at that depth is just above freezing. Pressure is 41 atmospheres. No human being could survive those conditions." "Then what are we listening to?" Catherine demanded. Before anyone could answer, the lights on the research vessel began to flicker. Not the random fluctuations of a power surge, but a deliberate pattern. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. The same pattern Thomas had used to signal her during their night dives when they needed to communicate silently. "He's coming up," Lucy announced, her voice barely above a whisper. "The sonar contact is ascending rapidly. Current depth, 350 meters and rising." Catherine's blood turned to ice water in her veins. How fast? Faster than should be possible for any diver. He's not decompressing. He's just rising. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. Any diver ascending that rapidly from such depths would suffer catastrophic decompression sickness. The bends would kill them within minutes. Their blood would literally boil. Their organs would rupture. Their brain would hemorrhage. Yet something was coming up from the crushing darkness of the deep ocean, and it was using Thomas Brennan's voice to call her name. 300 meters, Lucy reported. 250. The ascent rate is increasing. "Get us out of here," Catherine ordered suddenly. "Now, start the engines and get us." The radio erupted with Thomas's voice, but this time it was different, urgent, almost desperate. Catherine, don't leave me again. You left me here in the dark, and I've been waiting so long. I've learned things, Catherine. Terrible, wonderful things about what lives in the deep places. About what happens to divers who go too far down and stay too long. Come to me, Catherine. Come see what I've become. The vessel's engines coughed once and died. In the sudden silence, they could hear something else. Something that made every person on the bridge question their sanity. From somewhere beneath the hull of their ship came the unmistakable sound of knocking. Deliberate, rhythmic knocking, as if someone was trapped beneath their vessel and trying to get their attention. 200 meters, Lucy whispered. 150. 100. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. It was definitely coming from directly below them, and it was following the same SOS pattern as the lights. 50 meters, Torres announced, his voice cracking with strain. Whatever it is, it's almost at the surface. Catherine grabbed the emergency diving gear and began suiting up with shaking hands. I have to go down there. Absolutely not. O'Sullivan grabbed her arm. Doc, that thing calling your name ain't human anymore. Whatever Thomas Brennan became down there in the dark, it ain't what you remember. You don't understand, Catherine insisted, her eyes wild with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. When we were diving together, Thomas and I, we were exploring the Mariana Trench system. We were looking for new species in the deep thermal vents. On his last dive, he thought he'd found something incredible, a new form of life that existed in the deepest parts of the ocean. What kind of life? Weber demanded. Something that could survive in conditions that would kill any known organism. Something that might be able to adapt to extreme environments by incorporating other life forms. Thomas believed it was the evolutionary key to deep space exploration. Life that could survive in the vacuum of space by first surviving in the crushing depths of our own planet. The pieces were falling into place in everyone's mind, and the picture they formed was horrifying. 30 meters, Lucy reported. 20. 10. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than any sound could have been. Then, from directly beneath their hull, came a new sound. Scraping. Something was scraping against the metal of their ship, and it was moving from stern to bow with deliberate, methodical precision. It's circling us, Torres whispered. Catherine finished suiting up and moved toward the dive platform. I'm going down. You're committing suicide, O'Sullivan protested. Maybe, but if there's even a chance that Thomas is still alive down there, still human, I have to try. And if he's not? She paused, checking her regulator one final time. If he's become something else, then I'm probably the only one who can stop him from coming up. She dove. The water was colder than it should have been for these coordinates. As Catherine descended through the dark layers of the Pacific, she could feel something fundamentally wrong with the ocean around her. The usual sounds of marine life were absent. No fish, no dolphins, no whales. Just an oppressive, unnatural silence that seemed to press against her eardrums like physical weight. At 30 meters, she saw the first sign that something was terribly amiss. Floating in the water column were what appeared to be pieces of diving equipment. A regulator, a buoyancy control device, fragments of a wetsuit. At 40 meters, she found more debris. But these weren't random pieces of gear lost in some diving accident. They were arranged deliberately, almost artistically, as if someone was creating an underwater gallery of lost diving equipment. At 50 meters, Catherine's diving computer began malfunctioning. The depth readings flickered between impossible numbers, and her air gauge showed readings that defied physics. According to her instruments, she had been underwater for 3 hours, yet she had only been diving for 15 minutes. That's when she heard the voice again, not through a radio this time, but somehow transmitted through the water itself. Thomas's voice, calling her name from somewhere in the crushing darkness below. Catherine, down here, come see what I've found, what I've become. She looked down into the abyss and saw something that nearly caused her to panic and shoot toward the surface. Far below, barely visible in the range of her diving lights, something large was rising toward her. Something that moved with the fluid grace of a sea creature, but had the unmistakable silhouette of a human diver. As it came closer, Catherine could see that it was wearing Thomas's diving suit. The same gear he had been using the day he disappeared. But there was something wrong with the proportions. The suit seemed to be filled with something larger than the human body, something that moved and flowed like water, but maintained a roughly human shape. "Thomas," she called out through her regulator, though she knew sound wouldn't carry far underwater. The thing wearing Thomas's suit came close enough for her to see inside the helmet. What she saw there made her mind rebel against accepting reality. Thomas's face was still recognizable, but it was no longer entirely human. His skin had become translucent, revealing a network of bioluminescent organs beneath that pulsed with an alien light. His eyes had become larger, adapted for the eternal darkness of the deep ocean, and they glowed with an eerie phosphorescence. Most disturbing of all, his mouth was filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth, and when he spoke, Catherine could see that he no longer had a tongue. Instead, something that looked like a small tentacle writhed in his mouth, allowing him to speak despite being underwater. "Catherine," he said, and his voice somehow carried perfectly through the water. "I've been waiting for you. I've learned so much since I've been down here. So much about what lives in the deepest places, about what we could become if we just let go of our human limitations." "Thomas, what happened to you?" Catherine's voice was muffled by her regulator, but he seemed to understand her perfectly. "I found them, Catherine. The life forms I was looking for. But they found me first. They showed me what life could be like if we weren't bound by the limitations of terrestrial evolution. They incorporated me into their collective consciousness, but they let me keep my individuality. I'm more human than I've ever been, and more than human at the same time." As he spoke, Catherine could see that his diving suit was filled not with a human body, but with something that looked like living water, a transparent, flowing substance that maintained Thomas's general shape, but moved with its own alien intelligence. "They want to meet you, Catherine. They've been waiting for someone with your expertise, your understanding of marine biology. They want to show you what they've learned from studying human physiology, what they've learned from studying me. Thomas, you need to come back to the surface. We can help you. We can find a way to reverse whatever's been done to you." Thomas's laugh was the most horrifying sound Catherine had ever heard. It wasn't entirely human anymore. It had the quality of water flowing over rocks, of whale song distorted by impossible depths. "Reverse it? Catherine, why would I want to go back to being limited by human frailty? I can survive at any depth. I don't need to breathe. I don't need to eat. I can communicate with life forms that have existed since the Earth's oceans first formed. I've become something magnificent." That's when Catherine noticed that other shapes were rising from the depths below. Dozens of them, all wearing diving equipment from different eras, different expeditions, all moving with the same fluid and human grace as Thomas. Every diver who has ever gone too deep, who has ever pushed the boundaries of human exploration in the deep ocean, Thomas explained. "We collect them. We preserve them. We improve them. And now, Catherine, we want to improve you." Catherine began swimming desperately toward the surface, but found that the water itself seemed to be working against her. Every stroke upward felt like swimming through increasingly thick fluid, as if the ocean was becoming more viscous the higher she tried to climb. "You can't leave, Catherine," Thomas called after her. "Not now that you've seen us. Not now that you know the truth about what lives in the deep places. You're part of our ecosystem now." Looking up toward the surface, Catherine could see that the hull of the research vessel was gone. In its place was nothing but endless, dark water stretching upward into infinity. Either she had descended much farther than she realized, or something was manipulating her perception of distance and direction. "Where's my ship?" she demanded. "What ship, Catherine? You came down here alone, remember? You've been diving alone in these waters for years, searching for me, searching for the truth about what happened to all those missing divers." Catherine's memory suddenly felt unreliable. Had there been a ship? Had there been other people? The faces and names of her supposed crewmates were becoming fuzzy in her mind, like trying to remember details from a dream after waking. "That's not," "That's not right," she insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. "Come deeper, Catherine. Let us show you what we've discovered. Let us show you what you could become." The water around her began to change. Instead of the cold, dark water of the deep Pacific, it became warm and filled with an organic luminescence. The pressure that should have been crushing her at this depth felt comfortable, natural, like being embraced by something that understood her better than she understood herself. "We know you, Catherine," Thomas continued, his voice now coming from multiple directions at once. "We know about your fear of the surface world, your fear of human connection, your fear of being ordinary. Down here, you could be extraordinary. Down here, you could be part of something greater than any human achievement." And Catherine realized with growing horror that he was right. The surface world had always felt alien to her. The deep ocean had always been her true home. The pressure, the darkness, the isolation, these weren't obstacles to overcome, but conditions that allowed her to be her truest self. She began, then stopped. What was she trying to say? That she wanted to return to a world where she felt like an outsider? That she wanted to go back to feeling like she was suffocating every time she wasn't underwater? "Join us, Catherine," Thomas urged. "Let us show you what you were always meant to become." The creatures surrounding her weren't monsters, Catherine realized. They were evolved. They were what humanity could become if it stopped clinging to the limitations of terrestrial existence. They were beautiful in their alienness, perfect in their adaptation to the deep ocean environment. One of them approached her, a diver whose equipment suggested he had been exploring these waters decades ago. Like Thomas, his human form was filled with the same flowing, luminescent substance. But unlike Thomas, this creature had evolved even further. His diving suit had become part of his body, fused with the alien life form to create something that was neither human nor machine, but perfectly adapted to its environment. "The process is painless," the creature communicated, though its mouth didn't move. The words simply appeared in Catherine's mind. "We preserve everything that makes you unique while freeing you from everything that holds you back." Catherine felt something touch her diving suit from behind. Turning, she saw that thin, luminescent tendrils were growing from the water itself, making contact with her equipment. Where they touched, her suit began to change, becoming more efficient, more integrated with her body's systems. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt a sense of coming home that was deeper and more satisfying than anything she had ever experienced on the surface. "Yes," she whispered. The transformation began immediately. Catherine could feel the alien life form flowing into her diving suit, merging with her body's systems, enhancing her ability to survive in the deep ocean environment. Her lungs adapted to extract oxygen directly from the water. Her bones became more flexible, able to withstand crushing pressure. Her vision changed, allowing her to see clearly in the absolute darkness of the deep ocean. But most importantly, her mind expanded. Suddenly she could perceive the thoughts and experiences of every creature that had ever been incorporated into the collective. Thousands of divers from dozens of countries, all explorers who had pushed the boundaries of human ocean exploration, all now part of something infinitely greater than the sum of their individual parts. She could see their memories. The German U-boat crew that had been trapped in these waters during World War II and chose to join the collective rather than die slowly from oxygen deprivation. The Japanese pearl divers who had discovered the creatures centuries ago and became the first human members of their society. The Australian marine biologists who had stumbled upon the collective during a deep-sea research mission in the 1980s. All of them were still individuals, but they were also part of a vast, ancient intelligence that had been exploring Earth's oceans since before human civilization began. "Welcome home, Catherine," Thomas said, and now she could hear the joy in his transformed voice. "Welcome to the deep places, where evolution has no limits and consciousness has no boundaries." Catherine looked up toward where the surface should have been and felt no desire to return. The crushing weight of the deep ocean felt like a loving embrace. The darkness was not an absence of light, but a presence of infinite possibility. She had found her true element at last. But somewhere far above, on a research vessel that may or may not have ever existed, radio operators continued to receive emergency transmissions from the deep ocean. Voices calling out in languages from around the world, all asking the same question. Can you hear me? I'm still down here, still waiting for someone to come back. And sometimes, late at night when the ocean is perfectly calm, divers working near these coordinates report hearing something impossible. The sound of human voices calling from depths where no human being could possibly survive. The voices are always welcoming, always friendly, always eager to share what they've discovered in the deep places, where pressure and darkness create possibilities that surface dwellers can't imagine. They're still waiting for the right people to join them, still calling out to those who feel more at home in the crushing depths than in the limiting atmosphere of the surface world, still looking for explorers brave enough to discover what lies beyond the boundaries of human evolution. The radio transmissions continue every night, broadcasting on emergency frequencies, carrying the voices of the Deep Ocean Collective to anyone willing to listen. Come down and see what we've become, they whisper across the radio waves. Come see what you could become too. And sometimes, late at night, experienced divers find themselves staring out at the dark ocean and wondering what it would be like to dive deeper than any human has ever gone before, wondering what secrets are waiting in the crushing darkness of the deep places, wondering what they might discover about themselves if they just let go of their fear and descended into the eternal night of the abyss. The ocean is patient. The collective is patient. They know that eventually, the right explorers will hear their call and choose to discover what lies beyond the limitations of terrestrial existence. They're still down there, still waiting, still calling out through the radio static, still inviting the brave and the curious to come home to the deep places where evolution has no limits and the darkness holds infinite possibilities. The question isn't whether they exist. The question is whether you're ready to answer their call. The North Atlantic holds secrets that should never surface. Captain James Morrison had been diving these waters for 37 years, and he'd never seen anything like the anomaly that appeared on his sonar 3 weeks ago. The massive underwater formation sat 40 meters below the surface, perfectly circular, as if something had carved a wound into the ocean floor itself. What made it truly unsettling was how every piece of metal within a 2-mile radius seemed to be drawn toward its center, creating what locals had begun calling the graveyard. Ship hulls from different centuries lay stacked upon each other in impossible formations. Victorian steam vessels rested atop World War II destroyers, which in turn crushed smaller fishing boats beneath their weight. The newest addition was the luxury yacht Maritime, which had vanished without a trace just last month with all 23 souls aboard. The water temperature drops 12 degrees when you reach the perimeter, Morrison explained to his crew as their vessel, the Northern Star, approached the coordinates. Radio communication becomes problematic, and whatever you do, don't remove your breathing apparatus, even for a second. His team consisted of 6 experienced divers from across the globe. There was David Chun, a marine archaeologist from Vancouver who specialized in deep-water recoveries. Catherine Wells, a former Royal Navy diver from Portsmouth, known for her work on classified submarine salvage operations. Then came Antonio Rossi from Milan, whose reputation for underwater photography had made him wealthy documenting the world's most dangerous dive sites. The remaining 3 were newer additions to Morrison's crew. Hans Mueller from Berlin had joined them only recently, claiming expertise in underwater engineering that Morrison desperately needed. Jennifer Blake from Sydney brought with her advanced diving equipment and a mysterious funding source that paid better than any legitimate operation. Finally, there was Dr. Patricia Vance from Boston, a marine biologist whose interest in the site seemed far too intense for purely scientific reasons. As they anchored above the graveyard, the ocean around them fell into an unnatural stillness. The wind died completely, leaving their vessel floating in water so calm it resembled black glass. Even the usual sounds of the sea, the gentle lapping of waves, the cry of distant gulls, faded into absolute silence. Depth charges went off here during the war, Morrison said, checking his equipment one final time. Official records claim it was a training exercise, but local fishermen reported seeing lights beneath the water for months afterward. Strange lights that pulsed in patterns, like some kind of signal. Catherine adjusted her diving mask, her experienced hands moving with practiced efficiency. And you believe there's a connection to the recent disappearances? The Meridian wasn't the first, Morrison replied, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. In the past 18 months, 7 vessels have gone missing in these waters. Coast Guard finds no wreckage, no oil slicks, no distress signals. They just vanish. David Chun was studying the sonar readouts when something caught his attention. Captain, you need to see this. The formation down there, it's changed since yesterday. Morrison peered at the screen, his weathered face growing pale. The metal graveyard had indeed shifted. Ships that had been scattered across the seafloor were now arranged in a perfect spiral pattern, all pointing toward the center, where something massive and dark waited in the depths. That's impossible, Jennifer breathed, leaning over Chen's shoulder to get a better look. Metal doesn't move on its own. There's no current strong enough down there to. Her words were cut short by a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A low, resonant hum that vibrated through the hull of their ship and into their bones. The sound lasted exactly 30 seconds, then faded away, leaving them all staring at each other in mounting dread. Dr. Vance was the first to break the silence. We should go down now before conditions change. Before conditions change? Hans questioned, his German accent thick with skepticism. What conditions? The weather is perfect. But Morrison knew what she meant. There was something about this place that responded to human presence, something that had been waiting in the cold darkness for far too long. The graveyard wasn't just a collection of sunken vessels, it was a trap, and they were about to swim directly into it. As they prepared to descend, Antonio noticed something troubling in his camera equipment. The lenses are fogging up, he muttered, wiping them clean for the 3rd time. But we're not even in the water yet. It's the temperature differential, Morrison explained, though he sounded unconvinced by his own words. The air above the site is warmer than it should be, like something down there is generating heat. The diving procedures began with mechanical precision, each team member following protocols they performed hundreds of times before. But as they entered the water, they immediately noticed the difference. The ocean here felt thick, almost viscous, as if they were swimming through liquid mercury rather than seawater. At 20 meters down, David's depth gauge began spinning wildly. My instruments are malfunctioning, he reported through the communication system, his voice distorted by strange electronic interference. Mine too, Catherine confirmed. Compass is pointing in 3 different directions simultaneously. By 30 meters, they could see the edge of the graveyard. What appeared on sonar as simply sunken vessels was revealed to be something far more disturbing. The ships weren't just sunk, they were integrated. Their hulls melted and fused together in ways that defied explanation. Metal beams from different centuries had somehow grown together, creating a massive underwater structure that resembled less a graveyard and more a cathedral. Jesus Christ, Antonio whispered, his camera flash illuminating sections of the formation. This isn't natural. Something did this deliberately. As they descended deeper, the water around them began to change. What had been merely dark became utterly black, as if they were swimming through ink rather than ocean. Their lights seemed to penetrate only a few feet before being swallowed by the darkness. At 40 meters, they reached the heart of the formation. Here, in a clearing surrounded by twisted metal spires, sat something that shouldn't exist. A perfect sphere, roughly 30 feet in diameter, made of what appeared to be the same dark metal as the fused ship hulls. Its surface was covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when observed. Are you recording this? Morrison asked Antonio, his voice tight with a fear he couldn't quite name. The camera, it won't focus on it, Antonio replied, frantically adjusting his equipment. Every time I try to film the sphere directly, the image becomes scrambled. Dr. Vance swam closer to the object, her scientific curiosity overriding her survival instincts. "There are inscriptions here," she reported, "but they're not in any language I recognize. They almost look like—" Her words were interrupted by a sound that froze all 6 divers in absolute terror. Whispers, dozens of them, overlapping and echoing through the water around them. But these weren't random voices. Each whisper was crystal clear, speaking final words in different languages, different accents, different time periods. "Tell my wife I love her," came one voice, distinctly British, fading into static. "Das Boot sinkt, das Boot sinkt," whispered another German, desperate and afraid. "Mayday, mayday, this is the Meridian." A modern voice, American, filled with panic. "Something's down here with us, something's." The whispers multiplied, becoming a cacophony of final moments. Last words from crews spanning centuries, all drawn to this place, all meeting the same unknown fate. French sailors from the 1800s mixed with Russian submariners from the Cold War, their dying words creating a symphony of human terror that had been playing on repeat in these depths for generations. Hans was the first to break. "We need to surface now," he shouted into his communicator, but his words were lost in the growing chorus of the dead. That's when they noticed the movement. The fused metal structures around them were shifting, not randomly, but with purpose. Ship hulls were rotating on their axes, creating new passages while sealing off others. The graveyard was reconfiguring itself, trapping them inside with the sphere and its endless whispers. Jennifer tried to swim upward, but found her path blocked by a massive piece of hull that hadn't been there moments before. "The exit's gone," she reported, her voice climbing toward hysteria. "The way we came down, it's sealed." Catherine, with her military training, took charge. "Everyone stay calm. There has to be another way out. We just need to—" Her words were cut off as every light in the area suddenly intensified, illuminating the sphere in brilliant detail. The inscriptions on its surface weren't just symbols, they were names. Thousands upon thousands of names, carved in letters so small they required close inspection to read. The names of every person who had ever died in these waters, going back centuries. And at the very bottom of the sphere, in fresh lettering that seemed to glow with its own light, were 6 new names. Their names: James Morrison, David Chun, Catherine Wells, Antonio Rossi, Hans Mueller, Jennifer Blake, Dr. Patricia Vance. "How is that possible?" Morrison whispered, reading his own name carved in metal that had supposedly been here for decades. The whispers suddenly stopped, creating a silence so complete it was almost painful. In that moment of absolute quiet, they heard something far worse than the voices of the dead. They heard breathing. Something massive was inhaling and exhaling in the darkness beyond their lights, something that had been waiting patiently for them to discover their names on the sphere. The sound was rhythmic, patient, almost relieved, as if whatever lurked in the depths had finally found what it was looking for. Dr. Vance, closest to the sphere, noticed something else. A small opening had appeared in its surface, perfectly round, just large enough for a human hand. Inside, she could see a soft, pulsing light, like a heartbeat made visible. "Don't touch it," Morrison commanded, but it was too late. Vance's scientific curiosity had been her greatest strength, and now would be her greatest weakness. Her gloved hand reached into the opening, and the moment her fingers made contact with whatever lay inside, every piece of metal in the graveyard began to sing. It started as a low vibration, but quickly built into a resonance that they felt in their bones, their teeth, their skulls. The sound wasn't just audible, it was physical, changing the very structure of the water around them. And then the whispers returned, but now they weren't just voices from the past. They were prophecies, speaking of futures that would never come to pass, of people who would search for the missing divers and find only empty ocean, of families who would wait forever for loved ones who had become part of something ancient and hungry. The sphere began to open like a flower, revealing an interior that defied the laws of physics. Inside was not mechanical components or ancient artifacts, but space, endless, dark space filled with points of light that might have been stars or might have been the trapped souls of everyone who had ever been drawn to this place. Morrison made the decision that saved their lives, though it would haunt him forever. "Surface Protocol 7, he shouted into his communicator, using a code phrase they'd established for the most extreme emergencies. Above them, the Northern Star's automated systems received the signal and immediately began emergency procedures. Explosive charges detonated along the anchor chain, severing their connection to the graveyard. The ship's engines roared to life, programmed to flee the area at maximum speed and summon rescue operations. But the 6 divers were still 40 meters down, trapped in a shifting maze of metal and horror. The sphere's opening was growing larger, and the space inside was no longer empty. Shapes moved in that impossible darkness, forms that had once been human but had been changed by whatever dwelt at the heart of the graveyard. They reached out with arms that were too long, faces that were too pale, eyes that reflected light like deep-sea creatures. "The sphere isn't a trap," Dr. Vance whispered, her voice filled with terrible understanding. "It's an ark. It's been collecting crews, preserving them, keeping them alive in there for what purpose?" They got their answer when the shapes began to speak, not with the whispers they'd heard before, but with voices that were perfectly clear, perfectly human, and perfectly terrified. "Please," called out a woman's voice from inside the sphere. "We've been waiting so long. The cold, the darkness. Please don't leave us here." It was the crew of the Meridian, still alive after a month in that impossible space, begging for rescue or release or death, anything to end their captivity in a place that existed outside normal reality. Hans was swimming frantically now, searching for any gap in the metal maze that might lead to the surface. "There!" he shouted, pointing to a narrow passage between 2 ship hulls. "I can see light." They swam toward the opening as one, but the graveyard shifted again, and the passage began to close. Morrison, being the largest, pushed the others through first, sacrificing his own escape to ensure his crew's survival. "Go," he commanded, his voice echoing through the water. Tell them not to come back. Tell them to mark this area as forbidden. Some things are meant to stay buried." As the passage sealed behind them, they heard Morrison's voice join the eternal chorus of whispers, adding his own final words to the collection that would play forever in the depths. They surfaced to find the Northern Star 3 miles away, its automated systems having performed exactly as programmed. The rescue took another hour, during which time they floated in the cold Atlantic, staring down at the dark water beneath them and listening for sounds that thankfully never came. The official report listed Captain James Morrison as lost during a diving accident. The graveyard's coordinates were classified, the area marked as a navigation hazard due to unstable geological conditions. No further expeditions were authorized, but sometimes, on calm nights when the ocean lies still as glass, fishing boats report hearing whispers carried on the wind, and sonar operators occasionally detect massive underwater formations that appear on their screens for just a moment before vanishing, as if something vast and patient is moving through the depths, searching for new additions to its collection. The sphere waits still 40 meters down, in water so cold and dark that light itself seems to die there. Inside its impossible space, the crews of 100 ships exist in a state between life and death, their whispers echoing through dimensions that human science has no names for. And somewhere in that chorus of the lost, Captain James Morrison's voice continues to warn away any who might hear. Don't come down here. Some graveyards are meant to stay undisturbed. The Northern Star was sold to a shipping company in Greece, its new owners unaware of what their vessel had witnessed. The surviving crew members scattered across the globe, none of them ever diving again, all of them carrying secrets that weigh heavier than the deepest ocean. But the sea remembers everything, and in the North Atlantic, where the water runs cold and the darkness runs deep, something ancient and patient continues to whisper, calling out to the ships that pass overhead, inviting them to join the graveyard that grows larger with each passing year. The whispers never stop. They never fade. They only wait for the next crew brave enough or foolish enough to descend into the depths and discover that some mysteries are better left unsolved. And in the cold, dark water 40 meters down, the sphere pulses, with its captured light, adding new names to its surface with each vessel that vanishes, each crew that joins the eternal chorus of the lost. The graveyard grows, the whispers multiply, and the sphere waits, patient as the deep ocean itself, for its collection to be complete. The crystal blue waters of the Mediterranean had always been Thomas Blackwood's sanctuary. As a professional marine archaeologist from London, he had spent the better part of 15 years exploring the ocean's hidden secrets. But on this particular October morning, 30 meters beneath the surface near the coast of Cyprus, something would change his life forever. The dive had started like any other. Thomas descended through layers of increasingly cold water, his breathing apparatus creating a rhythmic symphony of bubbles that danced toward the surface. The ancient shipwreck he was investigating lay scattered across the sandy bottom, its wooden hull long since claimed by time and tide. Roman artifacts glinted in the beam of his underwater torch, promising another successful expedition for the British Museum. But it wasn't the bronze coins or ceramic amphora that caught his attention. There, half buried beneath a coral-encrusted beam, lay something that shouldn't exist. A diving mask. Modern, chrome and glass construction with a distinctive blue silicone seal. Thomas felt his pulse quicken as he approached the anomaly. The mask was cracked down the middle of its faceplate, creating a jagged line that seemed to split the world in two. His gloved hands trembled slightly as he reached for it. The mask felt unnaturally cold, even through his thick neoprene gloves. As he lifted it from its sandy grave, something extraordinary happened. The water around him seemed to shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer asphalt, but inverted, distorted, wrong. Then he saw them. Flashes of memory that weren't his own began flooding his mind. A woman with auburn hair, her face twisted in terror as water rushed into what looked like a diving bell. A man's voice, American accent, shouting something about pressure readings. Children laughing on a boat deck under brilliant sunshine, their faces slowly morphing into expressions of horror as dark clouds gathered overhead. Thomas dropped the mask, watching it spiral down through the water column like a falling star. But the visions didn't stop. They intensified. He was no longer Thomas Blackwood, archaeologist from Surrey. He was David Morrison from Seattle, a commercial diver working on an oil rig platform in the North Sea. The year was 1997. The water was ice cold, and something had gone terribly wrong with the diving bell's pressure system. His teammate, Jennifer Walsh from Vancouver, was trapped inside as water began pouring through compromised seals. "David, get me out of here." Her voice echoed in his mind, but it wasn't coming through his communication system. It was coming from inside his own thoughts. Thomas tried to surface, his training screaming at him to ascend slowly. But panic was setting in. The visions were becoming more intense, more real. He could taste the metallic fear in David Morrison's mouth, could feel the crushing weight of responsibility as Jennifer's face pressed against the diving bell's porthole, her eyes wide with the knowledge that she was about to die. But there was more. Another flash. He was now Christopher Hayes from Dublin, an underwater photographer documenting coral reef destruction off the coast of Australia. The year was 2003. His dive partner, Michelle Dubois from Montreal, had descended too deep, chasing the perfect shot of a massive grouper. Her nitrogen narcosis was severe, and she was swimming deeper, always deeper, toward the abyssal darkness where pressure would crush her body like an empty soda can. "Michelle, come back up. You're at 45 meters. Christopher's voice, but coming from Thomas's throat. The mask. Thomas realized with growing horror that somehow the cracked diving mask was a conduit, a repository of the final moments of divers who had met their end in the ocean's embrace. Every person who had worn it, every soul who had looked through its glass faceplate in their final moments, had left an imprint. He was experiencing their deaths. As Thomas finally broke the surface, gasping and choking on seawater and his own fear, the visions continued to assault him. He was Alexander Petrov from Moscow, diving in the freezing waters of Lake Baikal when his equipment failed. He was Maria Santos from Madrid, exploring an underwater cave system in Mexico when the ceiling collapsed, trapping her in a tomb of stone and water. He was James Fletcher from Sydney, attacked by a bull shark off the coast of South Africa. His mask the last thing he saw clearly as the predator's black eyes rolled back white. But the most terrifying vision was yet to come. Thomas found himself looking through the eyes of the mask's original owner, a young woman named Claire Winters from Chicago. She was part of a deep-sea research expedition in 1987, diving to investigate unusual electromagnetic readings from the ocean floor. The readings were coming from what appeared to be a metallic structure, partially buried in sediment at a depth of 80 meters. As Claire approached the structure, her mask began to crack, not from pressure or impact, but seemingly on its own, as if the glass were responding to some invisible force emanating from the buried object. Through the growing fracture in her faceplate, she could see inside the structure. Bodies, dozens of them, perfectly preserved in some kind of stasis. But they weren't human. They were similar to humans, but wrong. Too tall, too angular, with eyes that seemed to track movement even in death. And in the center of the chamber, a device that pulsed with a soft, hypnotic light. Claire tried to surface, but something was holding her down. Not physically, but mentally. The device was calling to her, pulling her consciousness toward it like a black hole pulls in light. She fought against it, but her resistance was weakening. In her final moments, as her air supply ran out and the pressure began to crush her body, she understood the terrible truth. The device was a trap, a lure, and everyone who had found it, everyone who had worn her mask afterward, had become part of its collection. Thomas realized with absolute terror that he was still underwater. He had never surfaced. The memory of breaking through to air and sunlight had been another vision, another false hope implanted by whatever intelligence controlled the device. He was still 30 meters down, still trapped in Claire Winters' mask, and his air gauge showed less than 5 minutes remaining. But now he could see it too. The metallic structure, partially hidden by coral growth, its entrance beckoning like a mouth. The electromagnetic pulse it emitted was stronger now, and Thomas understood that each person who had worn the mask had brought it closer to full activation. He was the final piece. As his vision began to tunnel and his movements became sluggish from oxygen deprivation, Thomas made a choice that would seal his fate. Instead of fighting the pull of the device, he swam toward it. If he was going to die, he needed to understand what this thing was, what it wanted. The chamber inside was exactly as Claire had seen it 37 years earlier, except now there were more bodies. David Morrison was there, his diving helmet cracked open like an egg. Jennifer Walsh floated nearby, her face frozen in eternal terror. Christopher Hayes, Michelle Dubois, Alexander Petrov, Maria Santos, James Fletcher, all arranged in perfect rows like specimens in a museum. And at the center of it all, the device pulsed with increasing intensity. As Thomas's consciousness began to fade, as the last of his air escaped in a stream of silver bubbles, he felt his mind being drawn into the device. But instead of fear, he felt a strange sense of completion. The device wasn't just collecting bodies. It was collecting experiences, memories, the final desperate moments when human beings faced the absolute certainty of death. It was feeding on terror. Thomas's body joined the others in their eternal underwater mausoleum, but his consciousness, his memories, his final moments of horror were absorbed into the cracked diving mask that now sat waiting on the ocean floor, waiting for the next curious diver to find it, waiting to show them memories that were not their own. The mask would be discovered again, of course, perhaps by a group of recreational divers from Germany, exploring the waters off Cyprus next summer, or maybe by a marine biology student from Norway, collecting samples for her doctoral thesis. It didn't matter who found it next. The device was patient. It had been patient for thousands of years, collecting the terror and desperation of those who dared to explore the ocean's deepest secrets. Each new victim brought it closer to its ultimate goal, though what that goal might be remained a mystery as dark and impenetrable as the abyss itself. And somewhere in the Mediterranean's crystal blue waters, 30 meters below the surface, where sunlight barely penetrates, the cracked diving mask sits and waits. Because the ocean never forgets, and neither does the mask. The only question now is, who will find it next? The coral caves never let you leave. The water was perfect that morning, crystal clear, warm as a bath, with visibility stretching endlessly into the azure depths of the Bermuda Triangle's most remote diving spot. Captain Jake Morrison had been running diving expeditions for 15 years, but he'd never seen conditions quite like this. "Bloody hell, would you look at that?" whispered Dr. Oliver Pemberton, the marine biologist from Oxford who'd chartered Jake's boat for this expedition. His breath fogged the inside of his diving mask as he peered down into the water from the boat's edge. Jake nodded, adjusting his oxygen tank. "The coral formations down there, they're not on any of our charts. Never seen anything like it." The third member of their party, Thomas Eriksson from Stockholm, checked his diving computer one final time. "The depth readings are unusual. My equipment shows we're above a 70-foot reef, but the sonar suggests caverns that go down much deeper." What none of them mentioned was the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a calm sea, but something else entirely. No birds, no wind. Even the boat's engine seemed muffled, as if the very air around them had thickened into something that absorbed sound rather than carried it. Jake was the first to descend. The moment his head broke the surface, he felt it. A subtle pull, like invisible hands guiding him downward. The coral formations below were unlike anything in his experience. Twisted spires and tunnels that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. Colors shifting from brilliant oranges to deep crimsons that looked almost like impossible. Oliver's voice crackled through the diving radio as he joined Jake 20 feet down. "These formations, they're not following any known growth patterns." Thomas descended last, his camera equipment capturing everything. But as he focused his lens on the coral structures, something made him pause. In the viewfinder, the formations looked different. They seemed to be moving, rearranging themselves when he wasn't looking directly at them. "There's an opening here." Jake's voice carried through the water. "Looks like a tunnel system, big enough for single file." The entrance to the coral caves yawned before them like a mouth. The walls inside glowed with an eerie bioluminescence that cast dancing shadows on their faces. Jake led the way, his powerful diving light piercing the tunnel ahead. "The walls," Oliver observed, running his gloved hand along the coral surface. "They're warm, warmer than the surrounding water." The tunnel curved and twisted, branching off in multiple directions. Jake chose the widest passage, following it as it descended deeper into the reef. Behind him, Oliver documented everything, while Thomas filmed their progress. That's when they noticed the current. It was subtle at first, a gentle push that seemed to help them along. But as they ventured deeper, the current grew stronger, more insistent, as if the caves themselves were drawing them inward. "Jake," Thomas called out, his voice tight with concern. "My depth gauge, it's malfunctioning. Shows we're at 200 feet, but that's impossible." Jake checked his own instruments. The readings made no sense. According to his computer, they'd been diving for only 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. And the pressure. There should have been crushing pressure at this depth, but he felt nothing unusual. The tunnel opened into a vast underwater chamber, its ceiling lost in darkness above them. The walls were covered in coral formations that looked almost architectural, like columns and arches carved by some ancient civilization. "Magnificent," Oliver breathed, his scientific mind trying to process what he was seeing. "This formation predates anything in the geological record." But Jake was focused on something else. At the far end of the chamber, he could see light, natural sunlight, filtering down through what appeared to be another opening. "There's an exit," he announced. "We can surface here, take a break." They swam toward the light, but as they ascended, something felt wrong. The light grew brighter, yes, but it didn't feel like they were rising. It felt like the light was coming to them. Jake's head broke the surface first. He found himself in a small pool surrounded by coral walls that rose like prison bars toward a circle of sky above. But something was terribly wrong. "The boat," Thomas gasped as he surfaced beside Jake. "Where's the boat?" The circle of sky above them showed the same perfect blue as when they'd started their dive, but their boat was nowhere to be seen. Worse, when Jake checked his diving computer, it showed they'd been underwater for exactly 12 minutes, but the sun's position in the sky suggested hours had passed. "We must have gotten turned around," Oliver said, but his voice lacked conviction. "There must be multiple surface pools in this reef system." They spent 20 minutes floating in the small pool, checking their equipment, trying to make sense of their situation. Finally, Jake made the decision. "We go back down. Find our way back to the boat." The descent into the caves felt different this time. The current that had drawn them in before now seemed to resist their efforts to leave. The tunnel walls appeared to shift and change, passages that had been wide now seeming narrow, turns that had curved left now bending right. "This isn't the same tunnel," Thomas insisted, his voice strained through the diving radio. "Impossible," Jake replied, but doubt was eating at him. "Coral doesn't move. Caves don't change." They followed what Jake was certain was the path back to their entry point, but after 30 minutes of swimming, they found themselves in the same vast chamber as before. The same architectural coral formations, the same eerie bioluminescence. "We took a wrong turn," Oliver said, but he was studying his compass with growing alarm. The needle spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. Jake led them to a different tunnel this time, one that angled upward more sharply. Surely this would lead them out. But 20 minutes later, they were floating in the same small surface pool, surrounded by the same coral walls, staring up at the same circle of unchanging sky. "This is madness," Thomas whispered. "It's the same pool. Exactly the same." Jake's hands were shaking now as he checked his air supply. Still plenty of oxygen, but that made no sense either. They'd been diving for over an hour, yet his tank showed barely any depletion. The third attempt to escape was worse. The tunnels seemed to actively resist their passage. Current pushed against them. Passages that had been opened suddenly seemed to narrow, forcing them to turn back. And when they finally surfaced again, Oliver noticed something that made his blood run cold. "The sun," he pointed upward. "It hasn't moved. Not a single degree." They floated in the pool, the horrible truth beginning to sink in. Time wasn't passing normally here. The caves weren't following normal rules of physics or geography, and something was keeping them trapped. "Look at the walls," Thomas whispered. The coral formations around their small prison pool were glowing brighter now, and in that light, they could see something that hadn't been visible before. Shapes embedded in the coral. Human shapes. Divers, their equipment still intact, their bodies preserved within the living reef. How long have they been here? Oliver's scientific mind reeled. Some of the equipment looked decades old. Others appeared more recent. Jake's breathing was coming faster now, using up precious air despite the impossible readings on his gauge. "We need to find another way. There has to be another way." The fourth descent was desperate. They split up this time, each taking a different tunnel, hoping one of them might find an exit the others had missed. But one by one, they found themselves back in the central chamber. Back together. Back where the caves wanted them. "It's hurting us," Thomas realized. "The caves, they're alive somehow, guiding us where they want us to go." On the fifth attempt, they tried swimming straight up from the central chamber, hoping to find an exit through the ceiling. But the darkness above them seemed infinite. Their lights revealed nothing but more coral formations, growing denser and more complex the higher they climbed. And then Jake saw them. More shapes in the coral. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Divers from every era. Their equipment spanning decades of technological advancement. All trapped. All preserved in the living reef. "We're going to join them," Oliver whispered when they surfaced again. "That's what this place does. It collects divers." The sixth attempt broke Thomas. He refused to go back down, clinging to the edge of the surface pool, hyperventilating through his regulator. "I won't go back down there," he sobbed. "It's feeding on us, growing stronger every time we try to leave." But staying at the surface was an option. Their air supplies, despite the impossible readings, were finally starting to show depletion. They had to keep trying. Jake dove alone for the seventh attempt. He swam harder and faster than ever before, ignoring the current, fighting against the passages that tried to turn him around. But the caves were patient. They let him struggle, let him exhaust himself, and then, gently, inexorably, they guided him back. When he surfaced, Oliver and Thomas were floating motionless in the center of the pool. Their eyes were open, but they weren't seeing anything. They were staring at the coral walls, which were now pulsing with bright, hypnotic light. "Can you hear them?" Oliver asked dreamily. "The others. They're welcoming us." Jake looked at the walls again. The shapes embedded in the coral were clearer now, and they were moving, slightly, subtly, as if they were still alive, still aware, still conscious after all these years. "Join us," Thomas whispered. "It doesn't hurt. The coral, it keeps us alive. Forever." Jake tried to shake his companions back to awareness, but they were already sinking, not drowning. The coral formations were rising from the pool's bottom, reaching up to embrace them. Gentle tendrils wrapped around their arms and legs, and they smiled as they were pulled down. "Jake," Oliver called out as the coral closed over his face. "The caves never let you leave, but they never let you die either." Jake found himself alone in the surface pool. The walls around him were glowing brighter than ever, and he could feel something brushing against his legs. Looking down through the crystal-clear water, he saw coral tendrils rising toward him. He dove one final time, swimming with every ounce of strength he had left. But the caves knew him now, had learned his patterns, had grown stronger with each failed escape. When divers found the boat 3 days later, floating empty in the Bermuda Triangle, the search teams never found Jake or his companions. The official report listed them as lost at sea. But local fishermen know better. They avoid the area where Jake's boat was found. They know about the perfect diving conditions that appear there sometimes. The crystal-clear water. The unusual coral formations that don't appear on any charts. They know about the caves that never let you leave. And late at night, when the moon is dark and the sea is still, they sometimes see lights beneath the water. Bioluminescent coral pulsing in patterns that almost look like signals, like warnings, or like invitations. The caves are patient. They've been collecting divers for decades, maybe centuries, adding them to the reef, keeping them alive and aware, forever part of the living coral matrix. And they're always hungry for more. 3 weeks after Jake's disappearance, marine biologist Dr. Catherine Walsh chartered a boat to investigate the unusual coral formations reported in the area. The water was perfect that morning, crystal clear, warm as a bath, and somewhere far below, in chambers that exist outside normal space and time, Jake Morrison opened his coral-encrusted eyes and watched her descend. "Welcome," he whispered through the living reef. "The caves never let you leave. The coral caves never let you leave."